I never know with these things. Everyone out there, can you let me know if you're listening to me right now? Am I on? I have no idea what I'm doing here. As usual, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in internet shitlords, and I have no idea what I'm doing here with the machines and whatnot. Trying to now adjust it to. All right, I guess that's good enough, right? All right, am I here? Can you hear me? Please answer if you know, if you're listening out there. Send me a message if I'm actually on or not. I think I'm on. I can see myself now on the screen, so yes. Okay, we are good. Once again, this is the RPG Pundit, final boss of internet shitlords, and this is my Tuesday live stream. I say that like it's every Tuesday, but it's not. You guys know that I live stream irregularly. Usually it's either on a Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday, but depends. Okay, good. Well, better late than never. I've come up, says Chris. Thank you. Up and running. Very good. Hello, Starlaw. We're going to be talking about a couple of different subjects today. Obviously, one of them will have to do with baptism of fire, but another one has to do with the ongoing saga of how a certain faction of our society is celebrating D&D's 50th anniversary by crapping all over D&D. And this time, I'm not sure, actually, I have to say, I'm not sure if it has any connection whatsoever to Wizards of the Coast. It might, but I haven't found it, but it is something else. Anyway, so you guys are going to see it in a little bit. I just want to give the people some time to come on. Now that the message has come out that we're live here. Just there we go. Hey, look at that. I'm better than average today. I've managed to send a message on my YouTube community without accidentally disconnecting the video, like I did last time. Some of you will recall, where I was like trying to do something, and instead all I managed to do was have my my YouTube video turned off. Let's see who else we got here. Osiris, they're celebrating their conquest of it. Yeah. Shauner, D&D 5e isn't D&D, some would say, so not 50 years old. Well, some would say, but they'd be wrong. That's like saying that because cars today aren't like a Model T. I know it's not exactly the right analogy because there's actually much more easily measurable improvement in cars. But there has been some improvement also in RPGs, but most of it is lateral. But the point is, you know, the D&D is a set of mechanics that are meant to change. Games change over time. Chess wasn't always the way it looks like now. Backgammon, I could tell you the whole history of backgammon if you wanted it. It started as several different games that eventually evolved into what we have today. From like the start of the creation of what is today backgammon started about 3,000 years ago, maybe more. I guess technically, if you count Mancala as backgammon, like it could be, you could say it goes back to the Stone Age, but it didn't become precisely like the backgammon we have today until the 1800s. So that is quite the lengthy development there. Genre says chess maybe didn't change for the longest time. Well, chess was originally derived from an Indian. There's an Indian game called Charanga, and Charanga that's the direct ancestor of chess. And from there, from India, chess migrated to the east and to the west. And in the west, in the east, it became Zhanqi, I think is what it's called, which is Chinese chess. Very fun game, very similar. If you look at it, it's super similar to chess in many ways. It has individual pieces that have specific moves. Now the moves aren't all the same, but some of them are similar. The point is to trap the king, right? The emperor or whatever. There are some rules that it has that chess doesn't, and some that chess has that it doesn't, right? But they're you can see immediately the relation. And then in the West, it made its way through the Middle East and then Europe. But there too, you know, there were graduations of time and change, right? Like chess, because this was something that happened, you know, quite a few centuries ago. And chess, again, hasn't assumed its didn't assume its really final form until sometime in the, well, past the Renaissance. I think it would have been around the time of the Enlightenment, you know, around the 18th century again. Charles Anderson says, sorry if I missed it. What are you smoking? Well, I'm just starting to smoke. I've just packed my pipe and I'm about to light. So this is a Lorenzetti half volcano, and I'm going to be smoking Argento Natural. Chris Miller says, it, presumably modern D&D, is the skin suit of D&D that they stole and paraded around like they created, yet deny anything problematic about it at the same time. Yeah, now that's a whole other argument, because you can say, I think it's silly to say, oh, well, because this game that we play now, or that people play now, isn't exactly like white box D&D from 1974, it means it's not the same game. Because games usually aren't like that, actually, right? Like there are some games that now have become so traditional that they're like that, but most aren't. But it's a different thing to say what is going on right now with D&D, and in the last few years with D&D, is that the game has been hijacked and is now being run by people who mean it harm, right? And who are intentionally trying to deconstruct D&D, and at the same time are pretending that they're being honest brokers when they aren't, you know, or honest how do you say, honest guardians of the game, you know. Laranjeco says, I am going to say it for real, seeing the destruction of Warhammer by the woke hurts me more than what they did to D&D. Okay, I was never as much of a Warhammer fan, so. Climate Mountain says it was 80 degrees Fahrenheit today. It looks like it's 40 degrees in your well, I'm not sure what it is in Fahrenheit, but today it is about 12 degrees Celsius, which is quite cold. Not freezing or anything, but cold enough that I am in my winter clothes, as you can see. Calvin always says Warhammer fans could just print up models for armies and save money, use the old lore as they wish. Yeah, I think what Warhammer needs is like its own OSR movement. It's people saying, you know, screw Games Workshop. Let's just use a previous, you know, whichever one was the best edition of the 52 editions of Warhammer. We're going to use that one, and we're going to use that at those armies list, and that's it. You know, like we're not changing anymore. And then there you go. They can run that game. And then they'll probably invent a lot of a second wave Warhammer OSR where they'll invent really cool games that are like Warhammer, but not exactly that. Climate Mountain says, I thought that chess was invented at the Academy of Jondishapur. Well, no, chess itself is a Western game, right? But the game itself is descended from a game that was invented in India. And Chaturanga was the name of the game. I do not know offhand if it was created in the Academy of Jondishapur. But yeah, there were a whole family of games that went, like, because it went to the east and to the west, it went in both directions, that are related to Chaturanga, which is a game that is not particularly very played in India, right? Like it does still exist. I think there are places where people still play it, but it's not an incredibly popular game. The most popular game in India is a game called Caravan, which you play. It's kind of like high-powered tiddlywinks combined with pool. But it's a fun game. It is a very fun game. So it's that's their most popular board game. Jeff Adamo says, I pressed notify me, but butthole YouTube refused. Okay. I do not know why that would be, but it is something I've heard of a lot. And I mean, it's happened to me too, right? I've been there are live streams I was meaning to watch and I don't get a notification for it. So, you know, I believe you. Absolutely. It's happened a lot. And I'm not sure if that's actually like malice or just ineptitude, you know. Chris Miller says you can also order printed minis from people like Nick Beardia too. Yeah, that's right. And actually, I think if you put there, I had at one point, I don't know if it'll still work or not, but I had been given by Nick Beardia a discount code, which I think is Pundit 10. Yeah, I think it was Pundit 10. And like if you buy minis from Nick Beardia, you put Pundit 10, I think you get like 10% off on your order. So, you know, that's good. Feel free to check that out. It's pretty much entirely promotional. And since most of my fans are not like heavy minis guys, I don't think I've made anything from it, but I'll bring it up now that I've got it. Shogi, yeah, Shogi is another game descended from Chaturanga. Still Monger says the oldest versions of chess used a pop-o-matic to roll the dice. Okay, so we're now at 42 people watching. That's not too bad for a Tuesday, I think. So honestly, I have almost no idea. We just did, by the way, everybody who's watching this, Inappropriate Characters aired on Sunday, and we have now moved out of YouTube. Inappropriate Characters is now on Rumble and on Twitter. It gets simulcast as a live stream on both of those, Twitter X, whatever you want to call it, at the same time. And we did that, and I wasn't sure what to expect. I was half expecting, you know, like doing it on Rumble and then live streaming it at the same time with Twitter. I was prepared that there's going to be like 5 people watching and that would be it, right? But as it turned out, it was like the biggest views figures we've ever had. I think we had like 70 people watching on Rumble. We had at its peak 300 watching on Twitter. You know, so that's pretty remarkable. And so I'm saying all this mainly so that you should check out on Rumble the Inappropriate Characters channel. You can do a search for it. I'm sure you'll find it. Or Inappropriate Characters, which is I think at Inaprop Cars or something like that, CHARS, on X, and subscribe there so that you do not miss future issues or episodes of Inappropriate Characters. Our next live stream is gonna be on the 30th of June, so it's gonna be a while, but sign up now because otherwise you might forget and you might not see my notifications, as often happens, you know. All right, let's see if I can get this lit and then we'll get started. Looking pretty lit. Not bad. The problem is when I'm doing a live stream, I'm talking all the time. I haven't got a co-host. I mean, I could have gotten a co-host tonight, but I didn't want to get one. So my pipe will tend to go out because I'm not maintaining it with the same effort as I usually would. But we'll see how that goes. So let me see here. Graham Riggs says, according to my device, YouTube has classified this channel as made for kids. This channel being like my channel? Are you serious? It specifically asked me if the video was made for kids, and it isn't. I think I need to check that out, huh? Need to see what the hell that means. Mm-hmm. Let me see here. No, it's not made for kids. That's what it's saying right there. Okay. It's not age restricted, but it's not made for kids. I don't think that's the case, dude. I'm pretty sure my channel is still not made for kids. Calvin only says, I watched that show but could not find where the chat is. So I said, neither could I. Ryan insisted that there is a way to put comments on an X live stream. Maybe there is, but I didn't see it. I wasn't able to read anyone's comments. I don't know if anyone posted any comments on Twitter. So I think Ryan's going to have to do a bit of research on that and make sure that he puts the right settings when he goes live so that people can comment, because I think it's not nearly as fun if people aren't able to comment. But if you want to comment, go to Rumble. And anyways, in Rumble, that's where we have the super rants or whatever they call them there. The equivalent of a super chat here, which, by the way, if I will be reading a lot of people's comments tonight, but if you want to be generous, and if you want to guarantee that I'll read your comment out loud, then hit me up with the super chat here. We are super chat activated. We are not monetized in this live stream for reasons of precaution, mainly. And so if you want to help me out a bit, then send me a super chat. All right. So I suppose I think I'm going to start, just in the hopes that there'll be a few more people popping in. I'm going to start with talking about Baptism of Fire. First of all, as most of you know at this point, Baptism of Fire has been probably the most successful product launch of this year, if not of all time. It spent what was it, like about 4 weeks on the bestseller list, and I think 3 out of 4 were in the #1 spot, or almost 3 weeks #1 spot, which is just unbelievably good, right? Like, that is an incredible result, right? It's by far the biggest result that I've ever had with one of my products. And again, a big thank you to everybody who has supported me and who has purchased this game, picked it up, and I think that you're bound to like it if you did. So it's been great. I'm just checking here. Yeah, okay. So it's still also right now, Baptism of Fire is still in the #2 position, best-selling print title in DriveThruRPG. So that is really remarkable, and I just since I haven't checked today, let me see if the bestseller status is still the same. It's been lingering for a while now, but I mean, I'm guessing it's gonna pop anytime now. Right now, it's still an ELECTRUM bestseller right now, Baptism of Fire. So if you haven't bought it, this is a great moment for you guys to buy. Let's see if we can bump it up to gold, guys. Let's see if we can hit gold tonight. And I wanted to talk about a few things regarding Baptism of Fire. First of all, like I said, a thank you to everybody who's purchased it. Second, I would like to address in particular the joy that I feel every time somebody shows on social media the photo that they have of the book, even though there's also this bittersweet agony that I still haven't gotten my print books yet, but that's normal. That's what happens. It's my fault for living in South America, right? It means I'm often the last person to get my own books. But I love seeing other people so excited that they're showing the picture of their Baptism of Fire hardcover or soft cover. That's great. And I'm also even more excited by the fact that there are people that are making videos about it, that have done reviews about it. DM James has been doing he's done more than one video on the subject of baptism of fire. He's absolutely over the, he's over the top with glee about it because he's big into like Slavic stuff, and he's really, he's, I think, more Ukrainian or Russian or something, but he loves the authenticity of baptism of fire, and it's fantastic, right? It's like it's really nice to see people making those kind of videos. And also when people post about what they're actually doing with the game, and there have been, especially on X, I've noticed more than anywhere, but in other places too, people saying that they've, now they're starting to run a campaign, right? They've been creating characters. They talk about the characters they created, or that they're doing some kind of an interesting hybrid game, right? Like they're using Baptism of Fire, but they wanted to use the rules from OSC or something like that, or some other game. And they're talking about how it combines, and they're figuring out how to do it. And that's awesome too. Or people who are like, well, I'm not going to run Baptism of Fire, but these tables here are incredible for, me to use in whatever, Slumbering Earnside Dunes or whatever, like any game you want to name, right? Lamentations. Or that, this, I'm going to incorporate the monsters from this into my Greyhawk campaign or something, I'm going to make it into a region of my fantasy world or whatever. Like all of that stuff, I love it, right? And I don't care. I am in no way a purist. I'm not saying, oh no, this must be played as PS 11th century Poland. Fuck that, right? Like if you guys want to do that, that's great. That's the campaign I'm running, and that I'm going to be telling you a bit about tonight. But at the same time, I love it when people can take my ideas and some of my stuff, the content of my book, and cannibalize it for other campaigns, and the really interesting kind of mixtures that creates. I think that's an essential part of the OSR formula, is that ability to combine and recombine stuff to make a really unusual and interesting material, either in a campaign or in a book or what have you. So yeah, I like it. Let me see what people are saying here. Okay. Ultra American says, good evening, Internet Lord of Shits. Sad Wings Raging says, that's just crazy. You get them so late. Well, it's been especially late this time because the printer, like, I don't know what's going on in the US, but apparently printers, if you want to have like constant work and make money, open up a print shop, apparently, because printers everywhere are backed up. And I mean, especially in the US. So like it had been, I think Chris, my publisher, had ordered those books immediately on the day, like 4 weeks ago when Baptism of Fire came out, right? And they have only just shipped like 2 days ago. That was how much the backlog was. So there's clearly like a crisis of not enough printers. And I'm guessing part of that is like, nowadays so many, like, look at how many books there are on Amazon that are essentially also print on demand, right? But you don't know it, right? But they are. So I, printing is probably a really good trade to be in. You're going to do a lot better there than in like African jazz studies or something, like, or transgender interpretive surgery or something, like whatever it would be, like all of the woke things you could be doing in university. Go to a trade school, learn how to be a printer, like that. You'll be making money your entire life. Yeah. Urban Verse says, haven't had a chance to read Baptism of Fire, but love the heft of the physical version I got. The interior also looks great. That's awesome. Ultra American says, World of the Last Sun, Baptism of Fire, Invisible College, Lion and Dragon. I don't think there's a book you've made that hasn't made it to my wish list, LOL. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Sadwings Raging says Arch and Sargon getting a proper DM like Pundit would be a great series. Jesus Christ. I'm not sure. Well, I'm sure I could handle those guys, but it would be that'd be quite a thing. All right, so before I go, I figured it would be interesting for me to tell you guys. You know, normally I hate telling stories about my role-playing session, right? Like I know that there's some people that actually do like this sort of thing, but for the most part, if you weren't in the game, you're not going to be very interested to hear about the game. And I'm not going to tell it in the way of like retelling the play-by-play. I want to tell you guys in a broad sense what I've been doing in my Baptism of Fire campaign to give you an idea of one of the kind of things that you can do in a Baptism of Fire campaign. Now, being a sandbox, all of my games are essentially sandbox setting games. And so there are many things you could do, right? Like in Sword and Caravan, you can be, hang on, I do have this book. In Sword and Caravan, which is my fantastic medieval authentic system neutral setting for adventures along the Silk Road and for the Crusades, you can be doing all kinds of stuff. You could run a campaign that is set in like the intrigues of a specific city, right? Like, I don't know, in Tyre or in Acre or somewhere like that, right? During the Crusades, or anywhere else, right? Or you could do like a travel campaign where you're traveling along, right? Through the Silk Road. You can do a campaign where you're a group of people involved in the high stakes politics of the Crusades or of the wars that happen along the Silk Road. You can do a campaign where your characters are based in a single city and are looking to make their fortunes there. You can, of course, have the Silk Road Trader campaign where you're playing a group of people on a merchant caravan. In my Sword and Caravan campaign, which I've mentioned a few times now, the player characters are essentially escorting a learned monk further and further to the east because he was given a mission from the Vatican, from the Pope, to go forth to the east and recontact with these lost Christian communities that were rumored to be there. And so that's what they're doing. And it's been a very, very interesting campaign. But there are lots of different things you can do with any of my campaigns. So I'm gonna tell you what I've been doing in my Baptism of Fire campaign, which may or may not be standard for what you would do in a Baptism of Fire campaign, because you can run a Baptism of Fire campaign where the emphasis is that you guys are just like going to war with the pagans, right? Or where you are out there to kill monsters, right? Or you can run a game where you're like involved in the intricacies and intrigues of the noble families and the court. Or you can run a game where you guys are running a little domain, right? You're one of the characters is a noble and he has land, right? And there's a whole domain system in Baptism of Fire, so you could do that. There are lots and lots of different options. But before I get to that part, I wanted to comment on, I've seen a few reviews now. And by the way, people, I thank you to everyone who has gone back to the Baptism of Fire page after they bought it on drive-thru and submitted a rating or a review. I mean, the reviews are extra great, but if you haven't done that yet, it would be really nice if you could put in, if you bought it on drive-thru, if you could put in a rating, especially if it's like a 5-star rating, that would be extra appreciated, of course, because those ratings help, you know, the algorithm basically of how much attention the product gets, and it's good for them to have a high rating. So if you can do that, that's great. And you know, most of the reviews have been very positive, but there have been a few that have touched on a couple of complaints, right? Some of them say that there wasn't enough proofreading in the book. There probably wasn't. I don't think there's ever enough proofreading in a book. You know, like there's always going to be mistakes. And in this case, it was also a problem with that accidentally the publication ended up being from another version of like another pass of the proof. An earlier proofreading pass, not the final one that was intended. So there were mistakes in it that had been corrected, but because drive-thru published from the earlier rather than the later one, that didn't come out, and now apparently if we try to fix it, we'll have to shut down the whole thing or something, and that's one of the stupid things that gets in the way of improvement. So maybe like in 8 months time, when the game isn't selling as much, we'll reboot it in that way or whatever. If it has to be done that way, like we'll update. Like there should be an easy way. There should be just a way that you just automatically update these things, but no, they have to make it complicated, right? So anyways, there are spelling errors and there are some grammatical errors, and there are some of those that were caught, in fact, in the final sweep, but the product that got published accidentally wasn't the final sweep. The second thing is, of course, the art, the AI art, which I think most people have been really impressed by, actually, right? Especially in the context of knowing that the art is AI, the quality of it and how carefully curated it's been, right? And the kind of attempt by my publisher to make an ethical version of AI art, which is to say that the art is all the input for the art is from people who are long dead, and there would be no, there is no claim of theft available there, right? And so that leaves the complainers even more furious, though, because now the mask is off, and it's not really about, oh, they're stealing from us. It's they're taking our jobs, right? Which are two very different things, right? Because it's one thing to try to pretend, and even that is a stupid argument, that if some drawing you did of Superman or whatever is one of a million different inputs that an AI receives, then somehow the final product of that thing that the AI art does that looks nothing like your thing is still stealing from you because it learned from you, right? That's like saying anyone who ever looked at a Superman image that you drew is somehow stealing from you, right? It doesn't make any sense at all. But they like to use that claim to make it sound like they have a direct, actionable complaint to make. But the real complaint is that they're all terrified. People who are mediocre artists are terrified that they're going to be out of jobs because suddenly they can't charge you $600 for a single image, right? And that's it. The AI will charge you $0 or whatever it costs to pay for the AI. I don't know, $25 a month or something like that. So that's the second thing, and there's not much to be said about it. I think that a lot of people who might have been wary about AI art on looking at the book have been pleased with it, and are also satisfied with the fact that the AI art, though I don't think that's strictly necessary, but it's clever actually what Chris did, because one of the problems with AI art is that often the art doesn't look consistently thematic, right? And so by carefully cultivating what went into the algorithm of that AI, it allowed it to make something that looks thematic, and that's why it looks good as opposed to other products that don't look good that use AI art. It's about carefully, working out how to do it. So, that's I think most people are fairly satisfied with that. And there's like one other thing that I've seen a couple of times, which is in terms of the mechanics, there's hardly been any complaints at all. There's hardly been anything at all that people have actually tried to point out about the mechanics of the game itself, except that a couple of people that were writing critically about me or the game were trying to say that the witch hunter player character is either anachronistic, that's just a ripoff of The Witcher, or that it is an unbalanced character class, right? That's way too powerful. Okay, neither of those things are true. All right, now I will grant you that the image that is on that particular section of that class, and Chris is the only one that could answer to this in one way or another, it does look sort of like, not exactly, I don't know. I've looked at, I saw exactly, I think, 1.5 episodes of the Witcher TV show. That's my only experience with The Witcher. I haven't read the books, haven't played the video game, haven't played any other games related to it, and I only watched like 1.5 episodes of the Witcher TV show and said this is crap and just left it, right? So I had no context of those. And like the image that is there for the witch hunter, I think if you like really squint and are trying to like make an argument, looks a tiny bit like The Witcher. Like he's got, The Witcher. I don't even remember. Is he like? Does he have like all white hair or something? Or like, because the guy on here is just clearly a guy that's old, right? He's got like gray hair. He's got a beard, right? It's not like some kind of unnatural white color. And I thought that The Witcher dressed mostly in black, and this guy's not in black. He's like in, he's in woodland clothes, like that. There isn't that much of a resemblance, actually. It's very clearly not just some choice of copy, right? But then they also say that the class itself is somehow a ripoff. Just 1 second. I'm going to try to catch up here with the chat. Matthew Sinan says, "How long is the stream been going?" We've been live for 36 minutes now. We started at 9 Eastern. Dragon Shot says, "I think Pundit would probably lose his mind DMing for Arch and Sargon with them meandering and pussyfooting around." I don't know. A lot of my players do that too. I let them run with it. I give them as much rope as they want to hang themselves. When am I going to discuss problems regarding the 50th anniversary D&D book? After I finish talking about Baptism of Fire, so there's still time. Let me see here. Photoshop is taking our painting jobs, says Shauner. The AI can do much better than WotC artist, says Osiris. Calvin Oni says, "I just paint minis. It can't do as bad as me." Dragon Chat says, "Who owns the images and such that get generated by AI?" Nobody. It's official. It's public domain. It wasn't created by a person. Weird Old Worm says, "Hello, Pundit." Hello. Osiris says, "So if I use AI to generate new IP, it just immediately gets absorbed by the public domain." Chris Miller says, "Technically, AI art cannot be copyright protected unless a substantial amount of changes were made. A lot of the images were substantially changed by me, but some were not." There we go. Chris Miller, "Well, what if I try to make something original in AI?" Denisto says, "I've just recently bought the book. It's gorgeous." Great Goldworm says, "Yeah, The Witcher looks like Elric." That's right. The guy in the section on the Witch Hunter does not look like Elric. He looks like an old, an old fighter going through a forest. Chris Miller says, "I did try to make it look a little like The Witcher, but very subtly and in the style of Ivan Bilibin." So there you go. Sarek says, "I just ordered Baptism this week. The waiting begins." So going back to the Witch Hunter, right? People say, "Well, this is not a real, this isn't a real class. He just put that in because of the Witcher." I would not have bothered to put something in because of the Witcher. I think, again, what we have here is a case of parallel evolution, right? That there's a long tradition in Slavic folklore of monster hunters and witch hunters, right? In Poland, the witch hunter was inspired by that tradition in as a class, and in particular in Poland, there was a particular type of witch hunters or monster hunters, really. I'll grant you, the word witch hunter is more specific, but that's because I think witches are the are a very common enemy of these types of hunters, right? But I could have said undead slayer or something. A witch hunter just sounds easier, right? And this tradition is most common in the Carpathians, where there was an entire class of specialists who were dedicated to the hunting and finding and killing of upiers, which are the vampires. They're the ancestors of the modern vampire, right? That is the reason that class is there. That and that mechanically, it made no sense to have magisters. Well, I mean, not mechanically, but really in terms of world building, because magisters are learned folk who have studied magic, And there just is not, in the early Middle Ages, there was hardly any of them, right? They were all in monasteries and things like that, right? So having them as a player character class, like there could be magisters in Poland, but they'd be in some monastery, or there would be some monk or priest in the service of like really powerful lords, because there are so few of these magisters around, right? So they're not going to be guys who are just going to be wandering through the forest. And so I wanted to have, so I have the Skomrozni is kind of the pagan hedge wizard tradition, and then the witch hunter is the Christian monster hunter who also has some hermetic talents that he uses to help him fight the monsters, right? So it's a combined class. Essentially, it's a fighter wizard combo, right? Because there is no pure wizard class, if you're a Christian at least, in Baptism of Fire. There's the pagan magician shaman class in the back of the book that could be playable if you're running a campaign where you allow pagans to play, or pagan characters to be played, right? But then the part that really gets me, because it shows that people don't understand math, is when they say, well, the witch hunter is in every way better than the fighter, right? So there's no point in being a fighter. You might as well just be a witch hunter, right? Well, okay. First of all, it doesn't work that way, right? I mean, it can work if the DM wants to do it. The DM just wants to say, okay, it doesn't matter. Stats don't matter. You can just be whatever class you want, right? But there are actually, in Baptism of Fire, there are minimum requirements for those classes, right? So a fighter only needs to have a strength of 9. A witch hunter has to have an intelligence 9, strength 9. That is because they're a combo of fighter and wizard. And the witch hunter, you could say, well, it's so much more powerful, but it's not. I mean, okay, a level 1 witch hunter is pretty good at certain things compared to other level 1 characters. I'll grant you that. But most of the classes that have 2 ability requirements will have that slight benefit at lower levels. Okay. But again, that is why they are more rare, because you need to have 2 stats at 9 or higher to play it. It's not impossible or anything, but it is a little better. So a witch hunter, when he starts with a +1 combat bonus. Hang on a sec. We've got a super chat here. Charles Anderson, I like how you stick to historical accuracy for your settings. Have you considered doing a Renaissance setting? Black powder and rapiers might be fun. It's definitely not out of my consideration to do a Renaissance setting. There are a lot of interesting settings that you could do in the Renaissance. But I would have to think about what I wanted to do, right? Like, and I'm not quite, I haven't settled on anything there yet. What I wouldn't want to do is something that just looks like Lamentations of the Flame Princess, which is set in the Renaissance, the late Renaissance, I guess. Because that would be just too similar, right? But yeah, I'm not ruling it out. I mean, I've now done the whole spectrum of the Middle Ages. I started in the late, then I went to the high, and now I'm in the early Middle Ages. But I'm kind of going backwards, so maybe my next game will be, I don't know, Dark Ages or Antiquity, ancient Rome or something. Who knows? It might happen. Oda Manjiro says Dark Albion is only half a century out from the Renaissance. Well, look, actually, in terms of like the Renaissance starts in different times in different places, right? Like technically, in Italy, 1376 was already the Renaissance, right? Whereas in England, 1376, you were completely buried in Middle Ages, right? It's completely medieval. But in fact, the War of the Roses can be seen as the flipping point for England itself, right? 1455, when the War of the Roses begins, England is a medieval country. 1485, when it ends, England is a Renaissance country, right? That change happens in that time. At the beginning of the War of the Roses, there were hardly any cannons in England. By the end of it, every force that's fighting has riflemen, right? So that tells you right there what the difference is. All right. Chris Miller says we need to do a Baptism Fire supplement for Constantinople. Well, maybe, but I don't know. The Constantinople stands would probably nitpick me to death. I'm not so convinced I would be capable of doing something that would satisfy them. But maybe. I'm kind of thinking of maybe doing one that instead is about the Via Regia, right? The path, but the trade route from Venice to Constantinople. Pundit, would you ever make a 17th century pirate game? I'd have to do a lot of research on that because I have never really studied the pirate age or pirates, in anything other than like an amateur capacity as a kid, right? Like I like pirates, like every kid likes pirates, but apart from that, I've never really looked into them in depth. So I would have to do a lot of research. I'm not saying I would never do it, but it's not something that's at the top of my list. Let's put it that way. So anyways, talking about the Witch Hunter here. The Witch Hunter gets a +1 bonus to combat, which is, I think, exactly the same as a fighter gets, right? At level 1, right? So a fighter gets +2 bonus to combat. There you go. A fighter gets a +2 bonus to combat and starts with 1d10 hit points modified by con at level 1, right? Their saving throw bonus is 0 at level 1. A Witch Hunter, he starts with a +1 combat bonus. His hit die is 1d8 at level 1. And he starts with a +2 save versus magic, right? So he's slightly worse at both combat and hit points. And he's the same in saving throws except against magic, okay? Then when they get special, right? Like, okay, the fighters and witch hunters both have the fighter ability of being able to attack a number of opponents equal to their level if those opponents are of 0 or 1 hit die. Okay, that's exactly the same power, the same ability that both of them have. It's kind of like a fighter training at killing mooks, right? Both classes have that. Witch hunters get a +2 to hit and damage against spellcasting humans, anyone possessed by a spirit or demon, demons, nature spirits, corporeal undead, incorporeal undead, fairy creatures, or supernatural monstrous animals. And on top of that, from that list, they get to pick one of those that I've just listed and get a +4 bonus to hidden damage instead of a +2. That's like their specialty, the thing they specially hunt. So they could be like an undead hunter or a demon hunter or a nature spirit hunter or whatever else, right? Or a spellcasting human hunter. That's probably a pretty good option too, right? So that is their big benefit that they get, contrary to a fighter. But the fighter, on the other hand, gets that they do a damage bonus against everybody, melee and range, equal to half their level rounded up. So a level 1 fighter gets +1 to damage in all weapons. And when he gets to be a level 3 fighter, it'll be +2. And when he gets to be a level 5 fighter, it'll be +3. When he gets to be a level 7 fighter, it'll be +4, right? So at level 7, the Witch Hunter is getting no special bonus apart from what he might roll on the dice, from which is still going to be only from that list of special opponents in his advancement table. Whereas the fighter by then will be doing +4 damage to everybody. Okay. And then witch hunters start with occultism, demon lore, and fairy lore +1, which, okay, I mean, I don't know how you could argue that a fighter should get that too, right? Witch hunters have +2 to perception checks to notice the presence of the supernatural in an area. Okay, again, not something that fighters would normally get. Witch hunters can perform summoning, which is the one type of magic, right? It's the magic of summoning and trying to bind demons. But as most of my players have figured out, trying to do that at level 1, even if you have the ability, is very, very, very risky, right? Unless you've got a lot of money to put into it to buff yourself up with like extra bonuses. You probably don't want to be summoning a demon at level 1 regardless, right? So that means that fundamentally at level 1, witch hunters are better than fighters at level 1 at attacking one particular type of enemy, maybe 2 particular types if you want to be nitpicky about it, right? Or they're better at fighting everything on their list for like 1 level against the fighter, and they're a little bit more better at one of the things on their list. Okay, but then, the argument is, the part that people are missing is that in this game, when you advance, you do it by rolling on a table, right? So every time you go up in level, you don't automatically gain, like the fighter gains 1d10 hit points at level 1. The witch hunter gains 1d8 hit points at level 1. After that, every time they level up, the witch hunter gets 1 more hit point each level, and the fighter gets 2 more hit points each level, if I'm remembering correctly, which I think I am. Yes, 2 more each level. So the fighter's already gaining double the hit points from level 2 onward, and he already started with a higher dice at level 1. Then after that, there's a table, which is for each class, right? So the fighter has their advancement table, their benefits table, it's called. Witch hunter has their benefits table. And the benefits table have different things on them. So you'll roll randomly twice, or you can choose not to roll and pick one choice from the table yourself. But obviously that lets you be more choosy about how you advance. But if you do that too often, you're getting the disadvantages. You're only ever getting 1 advantage instead of 2, right? Normally, it's better to try your luck and roll the dice, unless there's something you really, really want that you feel like you need the guy to have when he levels up. So both classes get, there's a hit points option in the table that if you roll a 1 or a 2 for the witch hunter, they get an extra 1d6 hit points, I believe. And if with the fighter, it's the same on a 1 or 2, but they get 1d8 hit points. Okay, modified by con in both cases. They both have the same chance of reducing their saving throw DC. I think they both have the same chance of getting a bonus to a 1 type of saving throw. But then after that is where things get different. So fighters, what they get when they advance is, apart from those, they get a 2 in 12 chance every time they roll of getting a +1 to hit with every type of attack, right? Aside from that, they have a 1 in 12 chance of a +1 to hit with 1 type of weapon, like say a sword or a spear or whatever. They then get 1 in 12 chance of getting +1 to horsemanship, which allows them to do better maneuvers on horseback. They have a 1 in 12 chance of getting +1 to shield parrying, which is a technique that fighters get special benefits to use. I do not remember offhand. Hang on, let me see here. Yeah, witch hunters do not have, like, everybody can do parrying with the shield, but only fighters and holy warriors get the benefit of adding their level when parrying with the shield, right? So that they're much better at using defensive fighting. The fighter gets a 2 in 12 chance of getting a +1 to initiative. And finally, he gets a 1 in 12 chance of doing an extra attack with 1 type of weapon. So like, it's, if he picks that and chooses the longsword, instead of doing 1 attack each round with the longsword, he can do 2 attacks each round with the longsword. Okay. On the other hand, with those things, right, because the witch hunter gets other stuff, right? He does get magical skills, right? He can learn different types of magic. And he gets bonuses to skills from a list, which include, fairy lore, demon lore, occultism, but also stuff like apothecary and herbalism, astronomy, history, law, medicine, sneak, theology, or wilderness lore. Okay, so he has more skills, without a doubt. Right? But then in terms of actual combat ability, how good they are at fighting stuff, they have 1 in 12 chance of getting a +1 bonus with 1 type of weapon, a +1 to hit, right, with 1 type of weapon. They have a 1 in 12 chance of adding an extra +1 to hit and damage against 1 type of opponent from the enemy's list of the witch hunter, right? They have a 1 in 12 chance of getting a +1 bonus to hit in general, but there's 2 options there. One is a +1 bonus in general to hit with all weapons. The other one is getting another magical skill. So the choice is actually a 50-50 choice, right? It depends on whether you want your witch hunter to get better at fighting or to get more magic, right? So it's not something that is just a clear 1 in 12 chance, right? You get a chance 1 in 12 of getting a +1 to parrying with a shield, but again, you're not as good at parrying as a fighter. And again, that's a binary choice. You either get that or you get a +1 to a spell check with one of your magical skills. So, it depends on whether you want to get better at parrying or better at casting magic. And finally, you do have a 1 in 12 chance of getting 1 extra attack with 1 type of weapon. So as you can see, though, what that means is that the Witch Hunter starts out with a slight benefit for fighting certain types of creatures. But very quickly, the fighter, in terms of pure fighting ability, will massively overtake him. The fighter is the best at pure fighting ability of anything. There are other classes that can do specific things better, right? So a holy warrior is going to have some benefits when he's fighting against, pagans or enemies of the faith, okay? Which is not an uncommon thing to fight, right? But he isn't going to be as good, generally speaking, right? And even in those areas, the fighter can outstrip him, depending on, because holy warriors also have to choose between bonuses to attack or skill bonuses or being able to learn new miracles, right? And the miracles are often good in battle too, right? But you know what I mean. So the thief can do a backstab, you could theoretically have a thief, if you got incredibly lucky, a thief at level 5 who could do a ×5 damage backstab, right? But they're good at backstabbing. That's all that they can do. They're not going to be great at everything else, right? Yodvingians will have, the barbarian class will have more hit points, probably, and maybe a better saving throw than the fighter. But they're not going to be nearly as good at actually fighting. They're going to be better tanks, right? So everything I've done in designing the game is a question of niche protection, and that's why it pisses me off when I see that people are making this criticism that is either because they're just shooting off at their mouth, they haven't looked at it at all, or because they've looked at the classes and have failed to understand the mechanics of the design that's in it, right? It's all very purposeful what I did, right? That I wanted to make sure classes have to be really good at their niche, and they have to also be the best at what they do in particular. Okay, so the fighter, the thing they do in particular is fight. No one's going to be better at fighting than a fighter, and I'm very proud of my fighters in Lion and Dragon and Dark Albion, because in my experience, I feel like the standard D&D fighter sometimes gets overshadowed by everybody else, and that's partly because the fighter isn't particularly good at anything else, granted, but it's more because there's a lot of times that the other classes somehow are close to as good at fighting as he is, and that should never be quite that way, right? And so my fighters in Lion and Dragon, Baptism of Fire, and all of the games I've designed are clearly going to be the most badass guys in the room in equivalent level, right? Obviously, if you've got, I don't know, a 10th level Witch Hunter and a 1st level fighter, the Witch Hunter will kick his ass, right? But if you've got guys that are roughly the same power level, he's always going to be a much more impressive fighter, and that's something that I like. I want fighters to be cool to play. I like playing fighters, actually. So I want them to be effective, and they are. Yes, let's take a look at some comments here. Chris Miller says, I also put Trump in the book as an Easter egg. We'll see how many people notice that. I did not notice that until Chris pointed it out to me, by the way. Major Vor says, can you define the species of deconstructionism you are referring to? Well, I'm going to get into that in the second half of the live stream, so you're going to have to hang out for a while. Sarek says, I just ordered baptism this week. Waiting begins. I feel for you, man. I'm still feeling for you. It's my books have now printed, but it's going to be a while before they get down here. Let's see here. Judd Gossick says, hello, I got here late. Hello, Judd. Glad to see you. Chris Miller says, Pundit has never seen the Witcher series. That's right. I have this habit of making games that are then compared to things that I've never had anything really to do with, right? So when I started, I'm sure you guys have heard me tell you this before, right? When I started writing Dark Albion, I had never read Game of Thrones. Of course, Game of Thrones, the novels existed at the time. But I'd never, I based Dark Albion as a setting on the War of the Roses and the Shakespearean War of the Roses epic, right? Like before there was ever Game of Thrones, there was Will Shakespeare's 100 Years War saga, right? Like it starts with Richard II all the way to the it's called the Hollow Crown. It's sometimes called, right? It starts with Richard II, then it gives you Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2, Henry V, Henry VI, and then Richard III, right? Sorry, no, Richard III, and then Henry VI. But anyways, the point is that no, Henry VI and then Richard III. I was right. Okay, sorry, I'm mind blanking now. The point is that I had done it doing that, right? It was nothing to do with Game of Thrones, and I had people starting to say to me, "I was like Game of Thrones." And around the time that I was running, I was already started, I think, running the campaign at that point. I think. Or maybe I didn't. I don't know. But right around the time I started running the campaign, it was also when Game of Thrones the series was coming out. Okay, and I did watch the TV series, obviously, but by then I'd written everything, like pretty much everything that ended up in Dark Albion, right? Because the Gazetteer was all done, right? And everybody, all my players, I had a couple of them that were absolute fanatics of the novels, and they were like, "Oh my god, this is just like the novels," right? And I'm like, "Well, I've never read the novels, sorry," right? And then I did, Sword and Caravan, and then there's like Assassin's Creed and stuff like that. People are comparing it to that, right? And I'm like, well, I've never played any Assassin's Creed. I don't play any video games, and then what was the other one? There was something else that people have compared my games to that. But obviously Baptism of Fire, The Witcher. I didn't even know, like somebody told me that that's actually the name of one of the novels. I've never read the novels. I've never played the game. I've never, the video game. I couldn't stand watching the series. So I watched like 1.5 episodes of the series and I was stupid. I understand that the series is not a good representation of the thing, right? But I don't read novels. I've stopped reading. I used to read tons of novels when I was 12, right? when I was 18, to be probably even up to until about the age of 24, right? And then I started realizing that there's novels aren't as good as stuff like myth, nonfiction, and primary sources. Like there's way more inspirational stuff, and novels are a formula, right? Novels are by definition formulaic, and especially stuff like fantasy novels. And I realized that it was very rare for me to do anything. Like ironically, I kept reading comics longer than that because they're so, they're not as much of a time absorbing thing, right? You read a novel, if it's 300 pages, it takes much more time than a comic, right? Even if it's a graphic novel or whatever. But I quickly dropped the novel, and I've never, and I played video games again as a kid, but I never continued to play video games as an adult. The only real nerd thing I do, apart from like, okay, I am a fan of certain TV shows, right? Like I was a huge fan of Doctor Who. I liked Star Trek. I liked Star Wars, the movies and whatnot, right? And I like The Matrix. TVs and movies, yeah, okay, I'll grant that. And RPGs, right? That's the tabletop RPGs are the one thing I did not quit doing. So any inspiration that comes from novels, animes, comic books, well, maybe comic books could be like, I can't say, for example, with The Invisible College. So The Invisible College is primarily inspired by my own experiences in occultism, in modern occultism, right? And by the movement that was called the Invisible College that existed in the 17th century, right? But I have, of course, read the comic book, The Invisibles, right? And there is a little bit of that in the Invisible College, without a doubt, right? But also it's because that was also what the creator of the Invisibles, who wasn't Alan Moore, it was the other guy, it was the other Scotsman. Oh, geez. How can I forget this guy? The other great magician of comics. That guy that did the Invisibles was also inspired by the existence of the real Invisible College in the 1630s and 40s, right? That later on invented Freemasonry, basically. So it's my ode to them, as it was his, right? It was his ode to them. Grant Morrison, thank you. Fuck, that's incredible that I forgot that guy. Like, I do have huge admiration for both Grant Morrison and Alan Moore, even though I sometimes make fun of him. You know, one of my future Pundit Files books is going to be a set of magic items from my Last Sun campaign. It's going to be a list of weird magic items, one of which is the Hand of Alan Moore. So there you go. You can have an epic campaign about the Hand of Alan Moore if you want. That's coming soon to the Pundit Files, available only at the Red Room store. We're currently on issue 12, the Mendicant. You can pick up any of the Pundit Files issues for just $3.50. Okay, if you got $3.50, you can buy the Pundit File. Let me take a look at some of the comments here. Urban Voucher says, any chance of a pronunciation guide for Baptism of Fire for those of us who have tongues and can't Polish well? Well, I did give a little bit of a pronunciation guide there, right? Like I pointed out, in Polish, W's are pronounced like V's, right? CZ is basically a kind of ch sound. I don't know how much else I can really tell you. You know, like the problem with Polish is it has letters that don't exist in our language. You know, like so it's very tricky. I think you should probably take a look. I'm sure there are some Polish pronunciation guides on like YouTube, right? Like, hey YouTube, listen, I'm pushing you guys now. I'm doing advertising for you, so please don't demonetize me. Check it out. Like there's so many incredible tutorials on YouTube for like everything, right? Like how to tie a tie all the way to like, there's one I looked up recently. How to get ice trays out of ice cubes out of an ice tray, right? When they're stuck in there, right? It gave me a life hack, right? All that life hack stuff. There's got to be tutorial guides to how to pronounce Polish names. I have it a bit by instinct, even though I don't really speak any Polish at all. I know like a handful of words and small phrases, and that's it. But the pronunciation I have because of my family, right? I'm sure there's things I do mispronounce. I'm sure that the Poles out there will correct me. Wayne Brack says, Witcher shouldn't be a class. In my opinion, it's a profession, a thing a normal person would do. I don't like magical abilities just because. But it's not just because. The witch hunters would have studied occultism in order to use charms and things like that and battle magic and what have you to protect themselves and to defeat the undead, right? Or the other monsters, demons or whatever they were fighting, right? So like these were people who were trained in the ways of folk magic and whatnot, right? Like that sort of stuff. Let's see what else we've got here. Surly Unicorn says the Beaver Master is the correct answer. He who controls the beavers controls the waterways. For those that aren't aware of this yet, the Beaver Master was a title of one of the officers of the court of the PS king from Boleslav onward, whose job it was to originally it started as guys that were in charge of stopping poachers from killing beavers. But then it became like, these are the guys that enforce the laws of the king throughout the land, right? And so one of the campaigns you can run in Baptism of Fire is where you work for the Beaver Masters. You yourself would be called Beaver Masters that would go around the land enforcing the king's law, you know? I get a feeling that game would have a lot of like phrasing. Although, I don't know, because in my part of the campaign right now, the Beaver Master doesn't exist yet because I started my campaign early in the PS period. And I don't know if when the Beaver Master happens, I know there's some players that I think would be anxious to be Beaver Masters. Star Adventure. Someone mentioned Star Adventures. I don't know if that's in the context of stuff people think I ripped off something from. Well, I have to admit that Star Adventure is the one thing that is a kind of a direct inspiration, in that the only reason I created Star Adventure is because I want to have an OSR system that I could run a Star Wars Empire era campaign with, and that's why I created it. So it obviously doesn't have any Star Wars stuff visibly in it, but the space opera setup of it is very clearly for running things like that, you know. So definitely is something you could use to run Star Wars in. Sadwings Rage says Pundit's hair is going from the Battle of Marathon to 300 hairs at a decent pace. Well, yeah, I suppose. I mean, that does happen. I don't concern myself too much about that, as you can rightly see. Judd Goswick says he looks brooding and badass. Is that me that looks brooding and badass? I'm not sure it was what you were referring to there. What have we got here? Orcs are evil, 5e. Yeah, you can fight and be a mage. Yeah, you can heal, cast, and fight. Sure, you can. Yeah, that is one of the big problems of later edition D&D, is that you have characters that can effectively do all of those things, right? And that there is very little niche protection that actually works out, because people, you know, the fighter is there and he can fight, but if in order to try to balance him, they design him that he has like superpowers or mystical powers, right? Essentially, like he does stuff that are very clearly not just being really good at fighting, you know, that instead you look at it and you're like, well, this has to be because he's like, you know, this is some wuxia shit or something, right? And then you have like wizards who should not be doing fighting, that you know, are instead, like, apart from casting like, you know, magic missile or fireball, that's fine, right? But if they're like, besides that, able to like do stuff where they end up fighting better than a fighter all the time, it's really terrible, right? Or thieves are especially bad at that sort of thing, where you know, thieves, if a thief can do backstab under any circumstance, then obviously they're going to be better at killing people than fighters, right? So it has to be that a backstab has to have very specific limitations on when it can be done. Starlaw says, love Star Adventure, got the print, hope for one day a bigger version with more sci-fi goodness. Well, one of the things I keep trying to work on is a space opera type setting for Star Adventure. Problem is, I am not nearly as good at doing a setting that is not historically authentic based, you know, like, I mean, World of the Last Sun, yes, but that's something that's grown organically. Maybe what I'll have to do at some point, I mean, honestly, that's probably the only way, is to like try to run a campaign of it. But I worry about, like, I mean, I still have to do a setup for it regardless. And the setup, I just keep getting this like writer's block of doing it. So at one point I thought, well, you know, probably my next big game is going to be my space setting, right? But it hasn't moved at all in months, right? So I don't know. I'm being honest with you guys here, right? That's just how it is. Lord Sapphire goes, can you put Alan Moore's god Glycon in Invisible College? Well, in theory, Glycon is a kind of an example of a sort of egregore, right? That you know, because Alan Moore recognizes that Glycon is a god that doesn't exist, but then worships him anyways. It's chaos magic shit, right? Like, but yeah, it's something that can certainly be in Invisible College. Speaking of inspiration, Adam Romano says, I've been incorporating men who stare at goats into my Invisible College campaign. That was based on a recommendation you made once. Yeah, The Men Who Stare at Goats is an incredible movie, and you should totally watch it. Sad Wings Raging says, Polish is easy. Welsh is the proof that Cthulhu exists. Well, yeah, I mean, you need a bucket of phlegm to pronounce any Welsh place name, so that is pretty tough, yeah. Great Cold Worm says, don't forget you're also a huge fan of Barbary Coast. Yeah, well, you know what? Even Shatner gets to make mistakes sometimes, right? Like, he was great in Star Trek. He was great in T.J. Hooker. Barbary Coast should never have existed. It's all fun and games. It's like, so you fancy yourself a potential beaver master, eh? Yeah, I could just see the interviews there. Chris Rose says, by the way, it was my birthday a few days ago, and my wife got me a hurdy-gurdy. I will now be a hurdy-gurdy player. The hurdy-gurdy is one of the instruments that Skomrosny used in Baptism of Fire. So there we go. It's positively medieval. I've heard it played, of course, but I have no idea if it's a difficult or easy instrument to master. I would assume difficult, but don't know. Chris Miller says, coming soon, Baptism of Fire merch, t-shirts, posters, coffee mugs. Probably not hurdy-gurdies, but you never know. Frank Distro says, Pundit, please do your take on the ready ref sheets. What are the ready ref sheets? So you're going to have to give me some more information, Distroso. You'd have to let me know. James R says, Pundit, do you mind if I shill for another anti-woke author's YouTube channel to introduce your audience to? As long as he's not someone from the bro SR type crowd or something like that. If it's a guy who's like, I'm here to complain about liberals and the Jews. Right? If he says that, then no. Okay, right? Like that is not what I'm in for here. But if it's a guy that is just an anti-woke guy, then yeah, sure. I mean, people will be able to make up their own minds anyways. So you're not going to win a lot of friends from here if you recommend someone who isn't actually so much anti-woke as authoritarian. Yeah. Frank Distortion says, watch Space Adventure Cobra for inspiration on a space setting. I've never heard of that. Is it some kind of anime or something? Yeah, I have no idea what the ready ref sheets are. I must have missed that somewhere. Are we talking about something from the Judges Guild back in the 70s, says Oda? Maybe that's it. Anyways, I think I should carry on while people answer my questions or whatever to them on the chat. I should carry on with talking about my own Baptism of Fire campaign to give all of you an idea of how a campaign goes. We've been playing now for some time, right? We started the campaign as I was writing Baptism of Fire, because obviously, I mean, the game originally was just Lion and Dragon, right? But I was making mods as I went along, and I was working out the setting, right? The world, and there's stuff that got written during the campaign, like some of the encounter tables and things like that. But for the most part, it was like mostly ready when we started. So it hasn't been a campaign I've been playing for tremendously long, right? Like actually, Dark Albion came out. By the time Dark Albion came out, we had been running the Dark Albion campaign for several years. Whereas here, that wasn't the case, right? Here, I first started making the book and then started running a campaign of it, right? Because, I mean, I knew that it didn't require the same level of playtesting, because essentially Baptism of Fire is still the same rules as Lion and Dragon. So it means that, it's time-tested. There aren't going to be major problems with it. And, the campaign, I decided instead of starting, like in the book, Baptism of Fire, I suggest starting in 1025, okay? Which is when Boleslav is crowned King of Poland, right? But I actually started it, I didn't follow my own advice, okay? And you don't have to either, right? You can start later or earlier than 1025. The timeline is there, right? I started in 991. So I started at the time when Mieszko was the Grand Duke of Greater Poland, and he was now very old. And it starts with basically Mieszko is pretty much aware that he's dying, and he gives an order that the lands of Poland that he had conquered, and his father had conquered before him, and then he conquered even more, are going to now be divided among all 4 of his sons, right? One of whom is a 20-something-year-old guy, Boleslav, who was already famous as a great warrior, and the other 3 of whom are prepubescent children. The one is the son of his first wife. The other 3 are the son of his second wife, who's the one that's alive now, right? So Mieszko did a lot of things well, but that will and testament was a freaking disaster, right? As you can imagine, because essentially he made the perfect setup for a civil war. In the beginning of the campaign, we started with the player characters going to Gniezno, the capital city, where they were going to, because a couple of them were nobles, but they were boot nobles, which is, if you've got Baptism of Fire, you know this. Those are the noblemen who are like, because there are these big noble clans, right? And they're like guys at the very tops of the clan, the magnates, who are usually very powerful. There are some clans that are more powerful than other clans, but they're the most powerful guys in the clan. And then there are people who have land, right? The members of these noble clans that have land. And those are the landed nobles. And then there is what are called the boot nobles, which are like the sons of younger sons and things like that have no land except their boots. Okay, there's no they control no land except what is under their boots, and so those are the boot nobles. And we had a couple of boot nobles in the game, and they're desperately trying to make a name for themselves. So they decided to go to the court, to the Easter court at Gniezno, the capital, and they make their way in there. And along the way, they run into a holy man who is not a priest or a monk. He's a layman, relatively young layman, who used to be like a street brawler, right? He was like he did public fighting bouts and things like that, right? Tough guy. But he worked as a bricklayer because that was what his father did before him. And when his father died, he became an apprentice bricklayer. And at one point, he was hit on the head with a bucket, knocked unconscious, and while unconscious, he had a vision of John the Baptist, who was telling him that he needed to go out and lay the bricks of the church in the lands of the pagans, right? And when he wakes up, he's all confused about this, but he had this vision that he didn't understand, and he decided that he was going to talk about it. He talks about some people, and they think that he might have been called by God to go and become a preacher. And so then he decides that he wants to try to get in touch with the most famous holy warrior in the land, who is a guy named Gerald, which is a real guy. He really existed, right? He was basically the right-hand man of Mieszko. And Gerald was a famous holy warrior for Christendom. So he also goes to the court, and the 3 of them end up meeting up, along with a 4th player character who is like the manservant of one of the nobles. He's like he's a Reicher's class, a warrior class, who's like his number 1 guy, basically, his butler, I guess you could say, but a fighting butler, right? And so they all end up meeting each other, and then they meet some nobles, they engage in some of the court intrigues, they find out that there's a lot of controversy about the will that Mieszko has put together, and then they end up managing also, because one of the 2 nobles is also a witch hunter. Him and the holy man end up meeting with Gerald, and Gerald looks at this guy who's brand new holy man and says, well, he thinks about it. He goes, he prays on it and whatever. Then he comes back and he tells him, look, we can't know for sure, but I have a feeling about you, kid, right? That sort of thing. But what I would suggest is you go forth for a year, go out and seek to do what you think the Lord is guiding you to do. Go and try to convert the heathen and fight evil. Join together with this witch hunter. You guys can work together. And in a year, if you're still alive and you still believe that you have been called by God and you show some evidence of it, then come back, right? So they agree with that, and they start heading out and decide to go out to try to do some great adventure, and they start out by heading to a town that they had heard had, in the nearby swamps near to the town, had like a dragon in it. And they get to that town. The holy man is disappointed to hear there are no pagans in that town, but they hear that there are pagans inside the swamp, right? So he's going to go try to look for them. And at the same time, they're very worried. Like they're not too sure whether they really should be hunting after a dragon when they're essentially, starter level. But they decide to do it anyways. And it turns out that the sightings of the dragon are actually the sightings of a giant toad, which is still a dangerous creature, right? But not as dangerous as a dragon. And they end up being able to confront it. And then they also run into some of the pagans from the swamp. But these are pagans that are really determined that they left. They had been living in nicer places, and they left into the swamp when the area became overrun by the Christian forces of Mewe, because they don't want to convert. So the holy man didn't have any real luck there. So they didn't do too well there, but they did kill a giant toad, and that was something. And then they went. They had decided to head off in the other direction, they were planning to possibly go to an area in the borderland with Pomerania, which is still a pagan territory, and go fight some pagans or go help one of the clans that has the fortresses along there. There's a particular clan, Nalesh, that has that controls a line of fortresses that divide Greater Poland from Pomerania. And they were going to go do that, right? But along the way, they go by Poznan, which is the business capital of Poland at the time, just like Gniezno is the actual capital. Poznan is where all the trade happens. It's the big market city. And in fact, I'm going to come out with in a couple of, in I guess 4 weeks or so, one of the upcoming issues of the Pundit Files is going to be Medieval City Guide to Poznan, which has a lot of interesting information about Poznan and about the magical oak wood that is just outside of Poznan, which is full of weird herbs and creatures of magic. So that shows you how close magic is to civilization in Baptism of Fire compared to in, Dark Albion or something like that, because it's a much wilder place. So they go to Poznan, and there they find out that in Poznan there's some kind of terrible ritualistic serial killer that's killing, for some reason it seems to be killing merchants on the one hand, and on the other hand it's whoever this person or people are is killing young girls, and they start to investigate this, and they go through a bunch of investigations. They think it must be someone tied to the merchants in some way because of all the merchants that are being killed, or an enemy of the merchants. They interact with a bunch of people. It's a whole investigative adventure, and eventually they find out that the serial killer is a guy that worked as a tanner there's a village on the other side of the river from Poznan, which is where they have like the unlikable things that, like the work that you don't want to have inside a city. And the guy came from there, and they take him out. They manage to kill him. He's really tough because he was in Congress with the demon that every time he made a sacrifice, he gained power. But they managed to kill him off. The witch hunter does most of the work. And then they're hailed, as local heroes for what they did, and it's all really great, right? Now, later on in the campaign, because I'm not going to get back to this probably, but in this summary, but later on in the campaign, they happen to hear again that in Poznan, that in fact, even though they were all praised and they were given like gifts and stuff, everybody bought them drinks and everything because they took down the terrible, witch murderer, right? It turns out that like 2 weeks after they left, the killing started again, because in fact there were two totally different killers. There was one guy that was killing merchants, and the other one, the one that they actually killed, that was killing prepubescent girls, right? And they weren't the same person. That was the thing that they missed. They're like, oh shit, so we can never go back to Poznan now. Everyone will make fun of us, It was very unfortunate for them. But they carried on. They had heard rumors of a Zartak. A Zartak is a firebird, it's called, and it's a magical bird, and it was supposedly in the forests near Miedźiereć, And a firebird is a very special creature because it has these feathers that are very powerful magic feathers. And it's very dangerous, though, because it can be aggressive, and also because it can basically enchant people. Like, people become obsessed with those feathers, right? But the player characters decided to go try to look for it. There was kind of like a gold rush of Zartak hunters in this town, which is a very small town called Mewe. But the holy man discovered that in that town, because they had a real, like, they were part of the rule of Mieszko and everything, but the guy in charge there, the chief noble of that particular the particular clan that controlled that land, he was this very lazy kind of guy, and he was also not a he didn't show some of the greater noble virtues, let's say, right? He was a bit an opportunist, and he was a guy that liked to cut corners, and he was involved in some shady dealings and stuff like that, right? Which the other noble, the one that isn't a witch hunter, quite liked, because he was also willing to do a whole bunch of shady dealings. The two of them got along like gangbusters, right? So the player characters, thanks to that guy, became friends with the head of the town, right? With the boss of the town. And basically in that town, because of this, he had made a policy that even though, like, every town under the rule of Mieszko is Christian, he made no effort to encourage Christianization. So half the town was pagan and half the town is Christian, and they were all pretty much getting along, right? Like, everything was good there in terms of, like, there was toleration, you could say, right? And the holy man realized that this was maybe a better opportunity for him than other ones, right? Because at this point, he'd encountered pagan rebels a couple of times along the way over there. But the problem with pagan rebels is that they're really pissed off at Christians, right? So he was hoping that maybe if there's pagans who aren't as pissed off at Christians, he could convince them. He decided to take John the Baptist's words literally, right? So he decided to start building an addition to the church in the town by first, he built an oven, and then he started making bricks, and then he was going to start laying those bricks to expand the church. And he was going to invite any of the young, any of the youths of the town who are basically from the destitute end, the poor Grodniks, as they're called, those boys, whether they were Christian or pagan, to learn the trade of bricklaying in the town, right? He was going to teach them how to make bricks, right? And so they came in there, and at the same time, he would preach them, and he would hang out in the town and cure people. Because one of the funny things about this holy man, who again, because he's not from a religious tradition, he's not he wasn't a priest or a monk, knows actually very little about Christianity compared to most holy men. Every time he leveled, he would get 2 miracles, right? So this guy is now level 5, I think. And he has all of the miracles. He can now do divine intervention in theory, though the ability for that is the DC for that is very high for someone of his level. But he has all the miracles. He became like a super miracle guy, right? And so he's becoming very well known because of that, right? And so he was doing conversion. The other guy was doing shady dealings with the boss of the town, and the witch hunter wanted to go out and get the Zartek. So they finally decide to get on it. And they do searching, and it's very complicated, and that people don't know a lot about the Zartak, and there are other people around in the forest, and they have competition. They eventually figure out that the Zartak, who had not been sighted in the area of the forest near the town, had probably, because of the number of hunters that came in there, he had moved off deeper into the woods. So they went deeper into the woods. And in the woods, with the random tables of bats of fire, you can run into all kinds of stuff, right? And so they ran into a couple of different pagan communities hiding in the woods. They ran into giant spiders. They found one of these pagan communities. There was another guy, like a monk, who had been captured by these pagans. It was probably going to be put to death or something. They're not sure, but it looked like he was. So they rescued him and they got him out. And everybody was really happy about that, except that as they were trying to head back to town, they were attacked by wolves, and the wolves ended up killing that guy anyway. So it was all for naught. Instead of having a chance to die as a martyr, later on, they were like, shit, we should have just left him there. He would have at least died as a martyr, right? Instead, he just got eaten by a wolf. It was terrible. And yeah, they had a lot of adventures in that forest. Eventually, they do They do find the Zartak. Chris Miller says, $10 super chat. Thank you, Chris. He says, I've got to go. If you haven't yet, please pick up a copy of Baptism of Fire and leave a good review. We are being shadow banned and would appreciate your help. Have a great night, guys. Thank you very much, Chris. Really appreciate it. So yeah, they had a lot of great adventures in the woods there. They eventually found the Zartak. They obtained some feathers, and then they realized that that anybody who gets one of the feathers, unless they make a saving throw, become obsessed with the feather like they're precious. They have to protect it, right, and all this stuff. The feathers are powerful because any magic that's cast to someone who's holding the feather will instead absorb the magic, right? Like it'll annul that magic, and then the feather will disintegrate, right? But it can protect you from a curse or from all kinds of stuff, right? So it's quite useful. But then they realized that it was going to be a disaster, right? Because everybody was like, so they had to like start the holy man started removing curses all over the place, and then they said, well, we got to get rid of these feathers, right? And the worst thing was that there were other people that had obtained feathers too, because the Zartak, when it is spotted, what it'll do is it'll drop one of its magic feathers and then fly off. And so everybody who looks at the feather is going to be, they have to do a saving throw, but if they fail, they're all going to want to get that feather. So they'll be distracted and the Zartak escapes. And it kept doing that for quite a while in the campaign. And so they eventually managed to they get rid of all the feathers because it just wasn't worth it to them, except for one guy, the shady noble, the one that isn't a witch hunter. He kept his, and he never told anyone about it, but also because he'd made his save. So, and then after that, they spend the winter in Miedzerich. It goes very well for the holy man, and they're getting ready to go back to see Geralt. But in the next year, Mieszko dies, right? And after he dies, there's an immediate conflict that emerges between Boleslav, his oldest son, and the families that support him, and Oda, the widowed second wife of Mieszko, and her three sons who are just kids, right? But the families that support her. And so there's going to be a civil war, right? And the player characters don't really want to have anything to do with that civil war. But they do want to find Geralt, and they have to go through a large area where there's already groups of nobles on opposite sides, because also there are nobles that have long rivalries with each other, right? So if one of them has gone to the band of Boleslav, the other one will go to the band of Oda. And so there's conflicts all over and distrust, and it becomes suddenly much more complicated to get around, especially if you've got nobles in the group, right? Nobody would stop a holy man, right? But as soon as you've got nobles, you're like, well, which side are you on? Now, luckily, both of these nobles in the party were from clans that are from way down in the south, right? Like from the area around Krakow, right? So it's far away from Greater Poland. And for the moment, the original split of the Civil War is at least among the clans of Greater Poland, because that's where all the action is happening, right? So they can still make their way through because their families are obviously neutral at the moment. They haven't declared anything for anyone, right? So they're getting away with it, right? And they manage to make it past a couple of dubious situations. Along the way, they go by a village where they almost missed. Like they came into the village and they had to buy some food or something, so they've got some food there and everything, and they were about to leave, and then they kind of noticed that something was funny, and they didn't realize that there had been a large group of about like 30 bandits who had at some point a few days before the PCs got there gone to the town, taking advantage of the chaos that's going on. They got to the town, they murdered the headman of the town, and they've basically taken it over as their lair, right? And then the player characters, I kept, I was careful in how I DM'd it, right? I didn't make obvious hints, but I made things that they should have been able to pick up as wrong, and they almost didn't catch it, right? They thought there was something weird in the town, but they didn't know what it was, and then they realized what it was. So they go back, and they're about to like fight, and it's by this point the player characters, I think they were like, most of them were level 3 or 4, so that's not super high level, and there are 30 of these bandits. So like their best odds would be to hope that these bandits run away. But if they don't lose morale checks, they could be in a lot of trouble there, right? Until suddenly, one of the characters, I think it was the sketchy noble, said to them instead, "Look, why are you hanging out? Why don't instead you come with us? You become mercenaries, and you'll work." You'll be able to take advantage of the war, right? they're like, oh yeah, okay, great, right? And so he convinces them, and suddenly they've got like these 30 guys that they don't really trust, right? And some of them prove not to be trustworthy along the journey, trying to rob them or talking about trying to kill them or whatever, right? And then they lose quite a few of the bandits along the way, but they eventually get to Gniezno, which is where Geralt is. And when they get there, Geralt remembers them, and he's shocked at how miraculous the holy man is. And what he tells them is that he can't choose either side in the civil war. Geralt was sworn to Mieszko, and he swore therefore to protect the sons of Mieszko. And there are sons of Mieszko on both sides. So he can't possibly join the civil war. He can't. Him and his house, because he is the leader of his own house that was given to him by Mieszko, his own clan, right? Could not fight in this war. And to avoid being pressured to do so on one side or the other, he's decided to go to Germany, where to the Holy Roman Empire, where they are currently suffering attacks from the northern Baltic pagans. And he's going to go fight pagans, right? And the player can say, okay, can we come with it? Yeah, sure. And they take the mercenaries, who are not happy about this, because the mercenaries were hoping they were going to get like to, loot and pillage areas of Poland or whatever. They do not want to go fight savage pagans in Germany of all places, right? But at that point, they're not gonna try to mutiny against Geralt, right? So they go with this big troop, and they travel along. They head to the northern marches of the Holy Roman Empire, and along the way they meet up with the Lord of the Northern Marches, who is related to the second wife of Mieszko, but that's at the moment, at this point, it was kind of coincidental. And they're going to go fight against the Veleti, who are the pagans in the north of Germany, and specifically they're going to the city of Radagos, which is one of the centers of their like 4 major tribes of the Veleti, and it's the center of one of those tribes, the Radegi, I think they're called. And they worship a god called Radagast, and they're going to go fight. They're going to go directly to try to besiege their capital city and cause a lot of looting and plundering, to teach them a lesson to fuck off and stay on their side of the Elbe River or whatever, right? And they go, they have some adventures doing scouting along the way, and then they end up going into a siege of Radagos, where I used the Pundit Files issue on medieval authentic sieges, on how to do siege warfare, which are very good mechanics if you want to run a siege in your D&D game. So check it out at the Red Room store. They complete the siege. They break into, and I researched all I could about the Temple of Radagast and the city of Radagos, right? And so it turns out that in that research, it was one of the great pagan temples of the Veleti, in honor of the god Radagast, and the temple was said to be surrounded by a kind of moat, and the legend held that the priest of Radagast in situations of danger would be able to summon a great beast that would come out of the waters of the lake that was next to the city and in through that moat, and would fight against the enemies of the priest, right? And you think about this, right? You think, okay, well, it's an aquatic creature. What could it possibly be, right? And it's like nobody ever gets this right? Because everybody say, well, it would be some fish or some sea snake or some kind of a giant lobster or whatever. It'd be something aquatic, right? Or maybe it would be, like, I don't know, a sea otter, maybe, or something like that, right? Like some kind of animal, like maybe a mammal that swims a lot, right? Or it might be some kind of great sea duck or something. No, for whatever reason, it's a giant wild boar that just lives underwater and comes out. Like this is what's great about medieval myth, right? It's just crazy, right? Like it's so funny. So the player characters break, they're part of the siege. They break in, they start to plunder the city. Some of them go there to the temple. They want to burn the temple down, right? And the priest summons this giant boar. You should have seen the look on my characters because I told them that there was a legend that was protected by a monster of the water, and they're like, "What?" Like they're expecting to get like an octopus maybe or something. I mean, no, a giant boar that starts attacking them right there. They have an epic fight there. They end up burning down the temple. They steal a bunch of loot. They've done really well for themselves. And then they start heading back. Along the way, because the holy man decides they haven't had enough fighting, he decides to do a vision, to receive a vision from God about where else he's needed, and then finds out that there's another group of pagans who are not the Valetti, but another related bunch of pagans that are assaulting this castle that belongs to a bishop on the River Elbe. And it was a very interesting castle because it was built in such a way that it looked almost like the castle was floating on the water of the river, right? Though it's actually obviously built on an island. And well, they decide to go over there and have another big fight with the pagans. And now they've finally marched back across. We're getting to the end of the to the present day of the campaign. They've marched back across into the territory of the northern marches, and they're going to go to the great city of Magdeburg, where they're probably going to spend the winter. But there's a twist. It turns out that one of the recent guys that came from, that were reinforcements sent to Gerald, another noble, comes along and decides to talk to the noble that's in our group and tells him that he has been sent by Boleslav. And Boleslav wants people who will be willing to help him in doing whatever is necessary to stop the Lord of the Northern Marches from going into Poland to assist his niece, the former queen, the former wife of Mieszko, right? The former Grand Duchess, I guess you'd say. Because Boleslav looks like he's pretty sure he's gonna win this fight, but only if the Germans don't interfere. So suddenly the players aren't going to be engaged in like diplomatic intrigue. That's actually, as of the last session, that's where we stopped. So it's not clear now. Are the players going to like try to help Boleslav? Will they decide not to? Will they tell Gerald? Because obviously Gerald can't do that, right? So we'll see. We'll see how it goes. And it'll probably make a lot of a very important determination to the future of the campaign. So that's what I've done so far in my Baptism of Fire campaign. As you see, it's had some investigative stuff, some political stuff, some social stuff, a lot of traveling around and finding crazy things, right? So it's quite good stuff. Just gonna let us get rid of this user here. We do not need trolls here. Troll Bogies is just trolling for trolling, which is kind of ridiculous. So let's get rid of him. I thought that my moderator was here, but maybe Cal had to go or something. Anyway, sorry guys about that. I was too busy telling the story to notice what was going on in the comments. My apologies for the troll. So that's what I've been doing in Baptism of Fire. Okay. And yeah, this is just one example of the kind of campaign you can run, right? Because you can do a lot of different things with it. I wanted to start off earlier and do like the historical campaign, right? Because that's mine. That's the thing that I like, obviously, right? Let me see what else we've got in the comments apart from the troll. Overkill Joe just joined the fray. Where's the troll? You just missed him. I just banned him. Lord Sathar says, I got hit by a Rhodesian farmer and now I'm a were-boar. Puns are the lowest form of humor. What else have we got here? Sorry, I was dividing plans. It's okay, Cal. Don't worry about it. I missed it too. I was too busy recounting the events of my campaign. So, anyways, we're good now, and I guess it's time to get on to the next subject, which is there have been a lot of things that have been going on in celebration of the 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons, and in celebration of that anniversary, a lot of those things have actually tended to be stuff that isn't really good for Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like one D&D is not good for Dungeons and Dragons. The VTT is not really good for Dungeons and Dragons either, for that matter. And there's obviously a lot of the stuff that Wizards has been doing in general has not been good for Dungeons and Dragons. Overkill says, "What are we smoking tape on it?" This is Argento Natural. It's my standard daily favorite. Arturo Fuente, that's nice. Good job, Dice Tail. All right, so what I'm going to tell you about, because we already know, for example, that they're going to maul Greyhawk. I recently did a video about this where Greyhawk will be the setting, the default setting of 1D&D. And that means if you're a Greyhawk fan, the only thing you can pray is that they'll just basically use the words of oh, it's Greyhawk, right? This is in the Duchy of 10 or whatever, right? And just say stuff that they're without really doing anything about it as a setting, right? That's the best you can hope for, that they do a really crappy job. Because if they actually put any effort into it, they're going to just mangle Greyhawk into an unrecognizable DEI disaster, right? It's going to be, the lords of Greyhawk are all going to be strong Black lesbian women, So this is not great for you. It's not good news. If you're a Greyhawk fan, this is the worst thing that could have happened to you. I'm a Mystara fan. Every day I thank the great architect that Wizards of the Coast has no interest in Mystara. All right. But I'm going to talk to you about another book. It's a book that has just come out from MIT Press, and it's called 50 Years of Dungeons and Dragons. It is a collection of articles, of essays, I guess you could say, about Dungeons and Dragons. And so by that title, it is presented as if it was, possibly an homage, right? Like that is celebrating 50 years of Dungeons and Dragons. Or at the very least, that it is trying to be an objective analyst of Dungeons and Dragons. However, it is pretty clear that that is not what is going on here. I'm going to shift this over just slightly because I need to be able to look at the article to read from it. So there are a number of different writers involved in this project. It's come out from MIT Press, which I assume is the publishing arm of MIT, right? Which you would think would be a good place to get a book on D&D, but keep in mind that recent events have shown that at the moment MIT is basically a communist collective, Turns out that they've completely taken over MIT, and it is full of garbage people now. And so let me first give you the blurb of what it says. 50 Years of Dungeons & Dragons is a collection of essays that explores and celebrates the game's legacy and its tremendous impact on gaming and popular culture. Okay. To mark the 50th anniversary, editors Primit Sidhu, Marcus Carter, and Jose Sagal have assembled an edited collection that celebrates and reflects on important parts of the game's past, present, and future. Each chapter, 50 Years of Dungeons & Dragons, explores why the non-digital game is more popular than ever, with sales increasing 33% during the COVID-19 pandemic, and offers readers the opportunity to critically reflect on their own experiences, perceptions, and play of D&D. That sounds positive, but that's not. As soon as you hear critically reflect, you know what it's going to be about, right? 50 Years of Dungeons & Dragons draws on fascinating research and insights from expert scholars in the game, including Gary Allen Fine, whose 1983 book Shared Fantasy remains a canonical text in game studies, John Peterson, celebrated D&D historian. I've never trusted that guy. Daniel Justice, Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Literature and Expressive Culture, and that's the hero of our tale tonight, by the way. And numerous emerging and leading scholars in the growing discipline of game studies, including Amanda Coate, Esther McCallum Stewart, and Aaron Trammell. The chapters cover a diverse range of topics, from D&D's adoption in local contexts and classrooms, and by queer communities, to speculative interpretations of what D&D might look like in 100 years. John Peterson is a guy who wrote a book about D&D already, a history book about, like, I think it was Playing at the World. Is that what it was called? I'm trying to remember if that was it. Yeah, Playing at the World, which is also published by MIT Press. It was basically like a history of D&D, and it's not, the book itself is not terrible, but a lot of the stuff that I've seen about the guy, like, he is not, this is not an anti-woke scholar, this guy, right? But what I have here is an actual essay from that book, not from Playing at the World, from 50 Years of Dungeons and Dragons. And this is one example of what that book has. And I'm sure this book is going to be very promoted in the next little while, right? Because all the usual suspects will try to convince people that it is an awesome book that everyone has to read, and that it is the true explanation of Dungeons and Dragons. So this essay is called Hack the Orcs, Loot the Tomb, and Take the Land. And the subtitle is Reflections on Settler Colonialism, Indigeneity, and Otherwise Possibilities in Dungeons and Dragons. And it's by a guy named Daniel Heath Justice, okay, who is, you will recall, he is the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Literature and Expressive Culture. Fuck. All right. And he says here, I don't know if I should, I'll start with this. I'll start with his opening paragraph. I don't know, I'm not going to read the whole damn thing, but I'll start with this. He says, I grew up in a world of ruins, literal and imagined. My mom's hometown was Victor, Colorado, a thriving gold rush city of 10,000, reduced to around of 300 when I was a child. Everywhere around me were the picturesque remnants of 19th century mining headframes. What does any of this have to do with D&D? Ore processing mills, fraternal order temples, mercantile shops, and churches of crumbling brick, rough-hewn stone, and rusting iron. The askew residue of stolid industrial pragmatism. Oh, this guy writes like a second-year undergrad, for fuck's sake. The askew residue of stolid industrial pragmatism and flamboyant nouveau rich fantasy. There were countless half-hidden old shacks, long abandoned mines, and bleached tailing piles to be discovered in the arid pine and aspen-covered mountains. A landscape seemingly forgotten and untouched by the modern world, discovered only by those willing to explore beyond the bounds of the past haunted town I called home. And then there were the Indian relics that have occasionally surfaced, arrowheads and spear points of an unearthed native burial site on the southern slopes of the mountain where my hometown sprawled. Most of its buildings empty of all but dirty detritus and memory. Oh my God. In the account that my mom learned in her short stint as a tour bus driver for a local mine, early white pioneers, in quotes, he says, in the area discovered a native woman's remains interred in a sealed grave, either somewhere on the slopes of the mountain or in a nearby gully. In that account, the body was looted and put on display in one of the mining camps. But what happened afterwards is unknown. I don't know if there's any truth to that story, or if it was invented to explain the mountain's racist toponym. But there's a long and ugly settler history of grave robbing and exhibiting native bodies, living and dead alike. So the story has a ring of truth. All right, I'm going to try it. That's the second paragraph. Third paragraph is still nothing to do with D&D. He's talking about his mom was a mix of all kinds of various immigrant backgrounds of, European Americans. He came from a background of poverty, but that through his father's maternal line, he is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation in what is today Northeast Oklahoma. Okay, it's really funny because if you do picture search for this guy, right, for Daniel Justice, you will see that he certainly, like, do a Daniel Heath Justice image search on Google. This does not look like an Indian man, right? Like, now I know that there are people who do not look especially Indian who are members of tribes. This guy might not be lying, in fact, about being a Cherokee, but there's a reason why everybody I know, anybody that I've known who's claimed to be a Cherokee because they're whether or not they're a member of the Cherokee Nation, you tend to have a ton of people that look absolutely 100% Caucasian, and they are in fact claiming to be Cherokees. And the reason that Cherokee is so liked as a choice for that is because what determines whether you're a member of the Cherokee Nation or not is whether you had an ancestor that was on the Dawes Roll, which was a census basically that was created in 1893 of the people that were of the Cherokee people who are living in the territory of the Cherokee lands, and basically that has been used as the standard by which you determine Cherokee citizenship. And there isn't a like sanguineity rule, right? So what it means when he says my maternal lineage, that means that probably his great or great great grandmother was on the Dawes Roll. That's if he's not lying altogether. Because also you get people like famously Pocahontas, right? Elizabeth Warren claiming to be Cherokee when she's not in any way Cherokee, right? I know a couple of RPG people who do that too, right? But in the Dawes Roll, he might have had his great great grandmother, which means that he would be either 1/8 or 1/16 or maybe 1/32 Cherokee, right? But with that, this guy has decided to run with it in our modern, in our modern diversity culture. It is a huge benefit to him. Obviously, he's become Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Literature and Expressive Culture, when it's very clear what he just told us in this essay is that he did not grow up in an Indian family learning Indian ways. He didn't learn, he wasn't raised by the Cherokees in a Cherokee culture. None of that stuff, right? The guy's like 1/8 at best, and at worst like 1/32 Cherokee, if he's not lying altogether. And this man has made his entire career out of that, right? So this is a blatant opportunist, is what he is. He continues for, Jesus Christ, four more paragraphs telling you all about his life story, about his family's Cherokee kin, and some of them are long paragraphs, right? About his siblings from his father's first marriage that were estranged, that he lived in an area of gold rush land that was seized from the Utes, Cheyennes, and Arapahoes in the 19th century, a place haunted with stories of gold-hungry white miners and dead Indians. You can all see where this is going when it finally gets to D&D, right? So, he's going on and on about this, and finally he gets to the place of he says, I looked elsewhere for a sense of belonging, because he basically is saying that he didn't feel proud of his past, right? And where better for a dreamy mixed Cherokee bookworm than a storytelling game set among the treasure-strewn ruins of a world inhabited by scrappy but watered-down descendants of nobler people in their now fallen greatness. Okay, and then he quotes the introduction to the Forgotten Realms campaign setting, and then he says, finally, we get to, like, Jesus Christ, after how many paragraphs, he gets to the gist of his thing, right? He says, my first clear memory of D&D is 2 beat-up boxes, 1981 starter set called the Magenta Edition. The other was the red box set by Larry Elmore. He doesn't remember how they came into his possession. Probably a summer flea market purchase. Blah blah blah. He'd already started reading The Hobbit. He became hooked on D&D and at everything he liked: storytelling, fantasy, inhabiting other worlds and characters. And the foundational template was one he was intimately familiar with: savagism versus civilization, the story of fallen empires and rising powers, decline and progress, primitive tribal people, and cultured settlers. It made a twisted sense to me, even though deep down I feared I already knew where my family and I sat in that binary, and it wasn't where I wanted to be. Yeah, okay. Nobody in this person's childhood or youth would have thought of him as an Indian, right? Like this idea that because he has like a great grandmother who was a Cherokee, right? Like that, and he looks completely white. Any of you who've done the Google search on this guy knows what I'm talking about, right? This is not like, this is not a guy with dark skin and a headdress or something, right? Like this is a guy that nobody would ever guess if he didn't constantly tell everybody about his Indian heritage, right? Other than that, like that's the only way anyone could ever know. And apparently he's made an entire life out of doing just exactly that. So he says, even so, when I started to create my characters, it wasn't the brash white warriors who appealed to me, or the dignified white princelings seeking to regain their thrones, or the noble white paladins charging down dragons to rescue the swooning white maidens in distress. These weren't characters who reflected where we lived or where we came from. I struggled with shame about my little mountain town, far from what I envisioned as the center of culture, art, and intellectual achievement. But I loved the place too, and to manage the cognitive dissonance, I imagined myself in a world of magic and mystery where difference was valued, not despised, and the game's explicit insistence on the DM's ultimate authority as storyteller made it possible to ignore the parts that wounded and enhance those that empowered, no matter what the canonical rulebook might state. The DM was the ultimate creator of the world's true story. That was something I understood at a visceral level. He was so close. The DM is the ultimate creator of the worlds, not through story, dumbass. Anyway. So he talks about how he's played in these various fantasy worlds and how it was an escape from his from the corrosive ideas of his peers, neighbors, and popular culture. This is a guy who hates where he's from, right? And that's subject of a lot of social justice warrior types, right? That they they in some way despise who they are and where they came from. I came to see myself and my family through more just judgmental eyes. The faggy backcountry weirdo with the rundown house and the loving but rough-hewn brown-skinned dad and mountain-bred mom. I really doubt his dad was brown-skinned in any way. Like, I mean, he isn't, not in any way, right? Like, you've seen the picture. But rather than imagine myself among the privileged, I doubled down on the outsiders. I love that this guy, okay, I doubt any of this is true. Right? I suspect he did play Dungeons and Dragons as a kid, right? And so we're talking about in the 80s, right? And he wasn't raised in a reservation. He's not playing with other kids who are Indians. He's not doing any of that. Right? I think all of this is an enormous historical revisionism where he's saying, no, even when I was 10 or 12 years old or whatever, when I was the faggy kid in the Colorado town, I was the one who was making my stories be about, misfit characters who were heroic, and not about like the standard evil practices that D&D has of, imperialism and colonialism or whatever. Like it's so much bullshit. And you notice that we're now like getting close to halfway through the thing, and until now, everything about this has been about him and his experience, which is the most boring thing an academic could possibly do, right? And something that only academics who don't have any actual training or talent in anything would ever do. He said, obviously, it was the demi-humans who appealed to him the most. I'll believe that part. Yeah, sure. Elves, dwarves, and halflings, his character class was the same as their race. They were outsiders associated with the land and wild places of the world. Except they're not really, not in 1980s D&D they weren't. Then he goes, and that continued even as I moved to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, where more scope existed for character advancement, if not much change in the foundational ethos of the game. And then he adds, as a side note, in chapter 17 of this book, right, of the book that this guy's essay is in right now, which tells us that this isn't just a fluke. This isn't just this guy, this one essay that's a shit essay amidst other books, other essays that are going to be positive, right? In chapter 17 of this collection, Aaron Trammell and Antero Garcia share their own reflections on these retrograde racial taxonomies and game mechanics as young mixed-race players. How many of us similarly found both empowerment and ensnarement alike in our first racialized engagements with D&D? This is such goddamn bullshit. You know, like, oh my God, right? Like, my D&D group, by the time I was in high school, at least, in my D&D group, we had a Polish immigrant. That's not me, by the way, an actual Polish immigrant. We had a couple of your standard Canadians. We had a couple of immigrants from Latin America. We had one guy that was the son of Asian immigrants to Canada. And all of us, you know, we wanted to play in the Forgotten Realms, you know, or Mystara or wherever, right? And we were just having fun playing it, right? Like there's the idea that like the kind of people, and I think in most of these guys' cases, this is a retroactive reinvention of their experience, right? Because it's complete. No, at no moment did the guy that came from Chile feel rage at the lack of Chilean representation in Mystara, right? Like nobody, right? The Asian guy, no problem. He was happy. He was playing his fighter or whatever. There was none of that bullshit, right? This is just all a historical revisionism to justify their present day communism. That's what this is. He says it's fair to say I didn't feel entirely human myself. Among the vast majority of people who lived in Victor in the 1980s and 90s, full human status was determined by proximity to unsullied whiteness and Euro-Western culture. Okay, this guy went out of his way to point out that there was like only the vaguest of connections to being Cherokee, and everybody else in his family was European. Right? Like they were all like long-term Americans, right? This was not like his parents weren't immigrants. They were the descendants of generations of Americans. This is complete bullshit. The idea that he did not qualify for whiteness is this guy trying, like he's trying to claim he's like Kulta Kinte or something, right? A crazy horse or whatever, right? It's just so ridiculous. Social acceptability seemed tenuous at best as the harder I tried to embody what the world deemed normal, white, straight, culturally sophisticated, well-spoken. Why would culturally sophisticated and well-spoken signify anything in this shithole of a town you were from, right? Like this seems to me much more to be his interpretation of his later life and his feelings of inadequacy after leaving that place, you know. It's all pathetic, but whatever. He says, so if my humanity could only be a constant and embarrassing failure, my fantasy demi-humanity could at least be successfully realized. As a half-elf druid or a halfling ranger, I could be a celebrated hero, an honored compatriot, a desired lover. As myself, I could only stumble awkwardly toward belonging. But humans and demi-humans weren't the only beings in D&D. These worlds were full of monsters too. The savage peoples, goblins, orcs, ogres, and all their kin, who burst forth from strongholds to pillage and slaughter villages and towns unfortunate enough to be in their path. From tribal goblinoids to dragons, beholders, and bullywugs. Even the degenerate civilizations of the fallen from grace dark elves, monsters were obstacles, not just to adventurers, but to civilization itself. Thus, their subjugation was only an act of self-preservation, not only an act of self-preservation, but the highest possible good to defend civil society, history, family, and the social order. Don't threaten me with a good time, dude. I mean, come on. And he goes, and this is where the savagism versus civilization binary really came in, for the function of monsters was, like that of all savages in this ideological structure, to die, and thereby give certainty of purpose to the civilized. Yeah, myth is about good versus evil, bitch. One side of this binary is culturally complex, sophisticated, literate, and ambitious. The other is brutish, superstitious, and little better than mindless beasts. Civilization depends on its opposite. Without savagery, for negative comparison, there's yeah. You know, the only person who can think this is a bad thing is someone who has only ever considered existence within the most advanced of civilizations, right? Someone who has never had even the threat of what savagery actually represents. Anybody else would understand precisely that. Even people that are from like tribal cultures understand that, which is why tribal cultures have enormous amounts of rules and taboos. The association of both demi-humans and monsters with indigenous and colonized people was hardly coincidental. It was baked into the earliest iterations of the games. Like Eugene Marshall notes, it's hard to ignore the fact that when he first created miniatures for fantasy races, Gary Gygax chose Turkish minis to represent, to depict orcs, and repainted Native American figures for trolls and ogres. I've never heard of that. I guess it's theoretically possible at a time where there weren't a lot of monster minis, but you know. Indigenous people were rendered monstrous and therefore killable, neither one worthy of mourning or compassion. The savage dies so that the civilized may flourish. But I didn't relate to the righteous because it's all about how wonderful he is. You see that? I can't remember even once playing a human in D&D. That's probably because you were a shit player, dude. You know, people who constantly play non-humans, it's because they're afraid that they won't actually have any personality if they play a human. And so instead, they won't have personality as a demi-human either, but then they can use those traits as a substitute for personality, which is why the best and most interesting character race to play is a human. You just have to actually get into it. Only later did I realize it was that I related not to the masculinist human champions, but to the goblins they killed without mercy. What does that say about you, dude? The goblins that go around brutally murdering people, the monsters of myth are the things you associate with. My imagination lay with those who inhabited the ruins. They remained furtive but defiant, the peoples far less cruel than the ones who persecute them. No, they're not far less cruel. The monsters in D&D, in myth, monsters are the cruel ones, right? Monsters are the ones that murder people and eat people. Okay, they're the ones that destroy everything in their path because they're creatures of evil. It is not a parallel to Native Americans or Turks or something like that. It's an aspect of myth. He says, in spite of the superficial polytheism and diverse deities in the various worlds, there's also a Christian triumphalism at play in D&D, with clerics and paladins in righteous crusade against the forces of darkness, with darkness versus light mapped readily into savage versus civilized underpinnings. Someone has to send this guy a copy of Baptism of Fire. This might have reassured the Christian fundamentalists in my youth and insisted the game was inherently satanic. Narrator voice, it did not. As befits, it's because, you know, that's what fundamentalists do. As befits its wargaming origins, D&D depended on such dualistic complexes at all levels, at all interactions. The bold and righteous fight to survive and bring civilization to the wilderness. The unrighteous, savages, heretics, and cultists exist only to be killed. This is just such a ridiculous paradigm, because that is not the case. In any D&D world, you have different races of human, none of which are purely evil, and then you have monsters, some of which are purely evil. There are some monsters that are good, right, in most D&D worlds, but you know, and neutral. But you know, orcs are not a substitute for black people. There are black people in some of the D&D settings, right? Theoretically, in many of the worlds, in pretty much every one of the D&D worlds, there are, just not necessarily in the same place, right? If you want to have somebody who has complex motives, who comes from a barbarian horde or something like that, you make them human. If you don't want them to have that, you make them monsters. As I grew older and began to connect the dots between my family's entangled histories and my love of fantasy, it became increasingly clear that in the dualistic Christo-colonial cosmologies of D&D, my world and so much of my family could only be on the savage side of the system. In what way, you dumbass? In what way? You're not even Indian. Like, there's nothing about you in all of your own admitted history that suggests that you are. You don't look Indian. You weren't taught to be an Indian. You didn't grow up in that culture. You didn't act Indian. There was nothing about you that had to do with that. Like, the ironic thing is this guy is also, from his biography, let me see, I'm going to switch down to the biography here. Where is that? I thought he had it here. Oh, here we go. Daniel Heath Justice is a Colorado-born citizen of the Cherokee Nation who lives with his husband in their feral forest Frenchies in the homelands of the Shishale people of coastal British Columbia. So this guy is gay, okay? And, you know, I presume that he's always been gay, right? And, you know, if you want to talk about being an outsider, I would bet that his experience as a gay kid in some rural town in Colorado was probably much more of an outsider experience than the fact that his great-great-great-grandmother was an Indian. Right? But for whatever reason, that doesn't, well, the reason is obvious. That doesn't fit the narrative he wants to talk about. He desperately wants to talk about how D&D is a racist game where monsters, you know, orcs are actually black people and goblins are actually Indians, and that this racism has to be condemned, right? And the problem is that doesn't, there, you know, nobody's suggesting that bugbears are homosexuals or something like that, or secretly homosexuals. So it doesn't fit his narrative. So instead of taking something that he could have talked about, which was his, you know, I'm not sure how much of an outsider experience he had because of that either, because who knows, right? But in theory, that was at least something he really was. You know, he was really a gay kid in Colorado in the 1980s or whatever. Right? He wasn't really an Indian in Colorado in the 1980s. He was someone who was descended from an Indian and has then later made an entire academic career out of being one, right? So it's just ridiculous. So but you know, because what he wants to do is condemn D&D as a racist game, he's instead trying to pretend that he was an Indian. No longer satisfied with the pseudo-medieval, pseudo-European worlds of prophesied monarchs returning to thrones they claimed by right of blood, I was much more interested in stories that spoke to the lands, cultures, and contexts closer to home. So then he's talking about how his love of Tolkien and D&D began to chafe. And then he especially points out that the other world influences on D&D, especially Robert E. Howard, has no beauty, no grace, no romance, just overt racism, blood butchery, and brutality, right? So he hated it even more. And as much as he once loved Middle Earth, it is still a world where lordship is born in blood and where inheriting country gentry were served faithfully by loving and dutiful servants, right? So it all offends his communist principles that he now pretends are his principles as a native. And while Tolkien's orcs, blah, 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 you know, Tolkien was racist too. There were white Indians in Dragonlance, which he takes massive offense against, you know, white-skinned Indians, you know, white-skinned people that acted like Indians, which is really a Mormon thing, you know, that's where they got that from in Dragonlance. I still love D&D, but everywhere I turned, the savage versus civilized binary flourished. The designers of every edition grappled with it in different ways, sometimes challenging it, sometimes burying it. But as Amanda Coate and Emily Seidel, people who should never be talking about D&D, have demonstrated, again, chapter 15 in this book, so the entire book is full of essays like this one, right? The basic template has been troubling, making it extremely hard to shift these deeply rooted and widely held cultural biases. The Atrigan clans of Mystara recycled every problematic Hollywood and pulp Western stereotype about Native people, both the noble and ignoble side. That's bullshit. The Atrigan clans is actually, for its time, I mean, I'm not saying it's a masterpiece of historical authenticity, but it was way more accurate than anything that had been presented before as like a Native American cultural parallel in a D&D setting. Dragonlance has noble savage but blonde plainsmen right out of Dances with Wolves. and he doesn't like gully dwarves either. And then he talks about Forgotten Realms leans hard on racial essentialism with its sadistic black-skinned drow led by vicious matriarchs and their terrible spider goddess, firmly melding anti-blackness with misogyny. Ravenloft has its pseudo-Roma Vistani, complete with the worst gypsy stereotypes of criminality and charlatanism. And then where to begin with the tribal cannibals that were Dark Sun halflings. Boy, again, now someone needs to send this guy the World of the Last Sun with its halflings. All right. Other Western fantasy games and imagined RPG worlds aren't much better. Warhammer, GURPS, Harnmaster, Palladium, Shadow World. So all of those are awful. He kind of liked ElfQuest. Big surprise there. Every game nerd I know likes ElfQuest. Octavia Butler's Wild Seed and other patternist volumes in the Seed to Harvest series were all about people of color finding space of their own in a world that too often subjected them to bothering dinners. So Butler was the first fantasy author of color I ever read. Blah, blah, blah. In these new fantastical places, civilization and savagery binary didn't dominate or even operate. The main characters were driven by purpose and principle, not unearned power. And there is no unearned power in the fantasy model, right? Like, yes, there are people who are like born to be king. That is one of that's like, you know, the lost prince and stuff like that is an archetype of fantasy, not just Western fantasy. It's an archetype of fantasy all over the place, everywhere. Okay, it's an Indian fantasy. It's constantly an Indian fantasy. It's in like East Indian fantasy, I mean to say, right? It's in Chinese fantasy. It's everywhere, right? The hidden prince is somehow a fundamental archetype of human experience for whatever reason. Okay, so the idea that that's like somehow Western is complete bullshit, right? But beyond that, no hidden prince gets anything without going through the hero's journey, right? And the hero's journey is all about individual struggle and earning their right to the power that they are born to, right? That they were born to but were denied in some way. That's like the story of everything from King Arthur and way before King Arthur all the way to Star Wars, right? So the idea that this is somehow some kind of white supremacy, it's complete bullshit. Total bullshit. He goes, I didn't let go of D&D, not completely. I remain a player and a DM in homebrew worlds where the savage versus civilization binary is actively contested, where diverse genders and queerness are normalized, but rape and sexual objectification aren't, where restoration of land, languages, and kinship are far more important than achieving wealth or glory. In these imagined worlds, grave robbers are villains, not heroes. Yeah, those sound like just a peach of a game to play in, right? It's just ridiculous. My fantasy, I guess he's a fantasy author, and here he's like he's promoting his own story. He goes, my fantasy series, I'm not even going to name it just to make sure nobody buys it, directly explores issues around indigenous dispossession and restoration in a secondary world fantasy setting that started as one of my homebrew worlds. Though decidedly not the only influence or inspiration in my life, and though without its myriad problems, D&D was one way I found a partial if imperfect language for naming my world, its limits and its possibilities and all its contradictions. The game's own limitations and the alternate versions of BIPOC, queer, and allied fantasies help me see myself and my family as not broken and ruined, but meaningful and complicated. Oh, fuck's sake. The world of tabletop role-playing is different now from when I was coming of age in the game. No more accepting the most overbroad stereotypes simply because they at least had a slim hint of indigenous resonance. The thin leavings on bones tossed from an imaginative banquet that others can enjoy. I would so give this guy a failing fucking grade if I was grading his paper. Never mind the subject matter, right? Because that's one thing, but just the way he writes is just nonsensical, just stupid, like first year undergrad stuff. He's now delighted that there are indigenous gamers and game designers presenting other possibilities, and he cites Coyote and Crow, a game that bankrupted its creator, as being an important step forward, a game that almost no one has ever played, right? That a bunch of people funded in order to virtue signal. And it is a game, I'll remind you, that the premise of it is a meteor hits Europe in the Middle Ages and all the white people die. And then, therefore, it creates a utopia of super high-tech Native Americans with magical powers. Yeah, that's the premise. That's the premise he wants to idealize. Along with Black game designers and visionaries from other communities, cultures, and contexts, BIPOC, queer, and other marginalized players have not entirely given up on D&D either. And then he cites some all-native D&D YouTubers and Black all-star gamers on Twitch, and he says, even Wizards of the Coast is responding in official D&D content, part of a larger company-wide move to address sexism, homophobia, and racism in published content, though not entirely successfully, with the controversy around Graham Barber's experience with content he wrote for Candlekeep Mysteries. Indigenous fantasists and wonder workers are flourishing globally. And he names a whole bunch of people nobody actually reads except extreme leftists who write crappy novels and such. Indigenous lives, lands, and relations continue to be strong, unbroken, undeterred, collectively enriching our imaginative horizons in ways that were far outside my lonely, limited scope when I was a disconnected, mixed Cherokee kid. You weren't a Cherokee kid. You were a kid whose great-grandmother was maybe Cherokee. You're a poor kid from a Colorado town, at most, assuming any of what you're saying is true. At best, that's what you were, and you're so embarrassed about that you want to create a mythical past for yourself. So he says, for all its problems, I'm still happy that I had D&D in my life. I'm glad so many people from so many backgrounds and identities have found something worthy and affirming in this strange, empowering, problematic, and complicated game. Oh, Jesus Christ. So, okay, that's it. All the rest is just him bragging about how proud he is of what he's done with D&D. So this is one, and remember, he specifically cites at least 2 other essays in this volume. So you have to ask, like, what is John Peterson doing there, right? Like this tells us what we need to know about John Peterson, right? As far as his trustworthiness as a D&D academic, when he allows himself to be in a book with these ridiculous pseudo-academic idiots, right? These nonsensical communist propagandists that are pretending to be saying something valid about D&D. There's nothing academic about that article, you'll notice. Right? It's just this guy telling his story and calling himself an academic, which tells you a lot about the state of academia today. It's really, really, really pathetic. So that is what we're facing with. Let me take a look at what your comments were, because I was just reading through all of that, so I didn't have a chance to take a good look at what was being said here. Let me see here. Charles Anderson says, these types have to get their virtue signal out first. It sets up their status. Overkill, Daniel Justice. Yeah, I suspect this guy's real name isn't, that it also is not Daniel Justice. Yeah, it's Daniel Heath Justice. I suspect that the Justice is he just named it himself. He added it himself. But I have no proof of that. Eric C says, if you do an image search of him, he looks exactly like what you'd expect him to. Yep. It's all fun and games says, should you allow multi-classing? Well, to answer that question, I take you back to the Trail of Tears. My goodness. My great-grandmother, Owen Maxwell says, my great-grandmother was full Cherokee and walked on the Trail of Tears. She married an Englishman. Okay, great. I mean, like that, there's nothing wrong about having Cherokee ancestry, right? But if you have Cherokee ancestry going back to your great-grandmother and otherwise have not spent time, you know, in the Cherokee culture itself, you can say you have Cherokee ancestry, but it doesn't mean that you're Cherokee, right? It certainly means that doesn't mean that anyone would have recognized that you were Cherokee growing up, you know, unless your family constantly talked about it or something. There are numerous of you are listing their tribal origins, and again, there's nothing wrong with any of that, right? It's fine also to be proud about whatever your ancestry is, right? And to be interested in it, that's also fine, right? But if you like start pretending like if because you've got a great grandfather who was, you know, Coast Salish or something, and you start talking about your totem pole or something, like you start acting as like you didn't grow up on the reservation, but you're like you're dressing in the clothes or whatever. You know, there are a lot of actual, you know, Indians who hate that shit, right? Like that's terrible. NAD says Gygax and Artisan are rolling over in their graves. Dicetail says 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Indians. Dragon Shadow says, yep, definitely another failed novelist using the hobby to get his crappy fiction published. Overkill Joe says, if that dude was giving that speech on stage, someone would have dropped a curtain on him in the third paragraph. Well, probably not at MIT, apparently, and not in a lot of universities these days. That's part of the problem. Universities are full of pseudo-academia now. They're just bullshit factories at this point, you know. Overkill Joe says, where's my X card when I need it? Xnard Prime says, pretend Indian virtue signalers are ridiculous people like Buffy St. Marie. Yeah, that one shocked even me. My God, the woman spent 60 years pretending to be Indian. She was actually just Italian. And she in Canada, Buffy St. Marie was one of the most famous Indians in Canada, right? Like she was legendary and she was prized and, you know, she was venerated by everyone, you know, especially in the left, obviously, but turned out to be a complete fraud. Incredible. Owen Maxwell says the scarf, jacket, and pipe discount his right to call out people for virtue signaling. Well, none of this is virtue signaling, right? This is just this is how I dress, you know. It's first of all, it's cold in here. You know, I go, you know, this is how I dress normally. I have a scarf, I have a jacket, right? In Uruguay, if you're in the kind of in the middle class, let's say, and up, people tend to dress more than they do in certainly in North America, right? Like there are a lot of Italian immigrants here, and I think probably that influenced a lot of the kind of style of the country. And so people do dress in a very different. They dress in a more European style than they would than you would see in the U.S. or in Canada for sure, right? The pipe is also not an affectation. I've just been smoking a pipe for Jesus Christ, for 30 years now. I've been smoking a pipe, okay? And I like smoking pipes. It's not something I do to show off or something. It's something I do all the time. It'll probably take years off my life, but they're the crappy years at the end. Jethro Tellenpo says, who cares? Nothing. Nobody here is going to buy them. Is that Jeffro? Is that like the Jeffro, or is it just some other one? Nobody here is going to buy a book. Yeah, but it's important to note that these are the type of books that are going to be very heavily promoted, and people need to know. If you see that there are people talking about how this is a great commentary on Dungeons and Dragons, now you know what is in there, and you should make sure other people know that too, so that they don't buy it thinking they're going to get a love letter to D&D or even a useful historical analysis of D&D. They won't get either of those there. They're going to get a bunch of leftist indoctrination essays, okay? NAD says, have you any Cherokee in you? No. Want some? I guess it works as a pickup line. All Fun and Games says, I struggle to justify my self-indulgent hatred for my hometown based on fantastical narratives I made up about myself. Yeah. He also makes fun of his white mom with insult. Yeah. Nice Tale says Gutenberg is regretting his life choices right now. The Russian Olympics is strong with this one, says Sadwings. Is this man published, says Owen Maxwell? He's not just published. The guy is the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Literature and Expressive Culture, which is incredible because, again, he's not culturally Indian, at least, you know. Jeff Adamo says they're always like, "Oh, I love D&D. I just hate everything about it." Yeah, exactly. Their love for D&D is just that they want to destroy D&D, right? It has nothing. They want to transform D&D into a vehicle for their identity politics, and that's all that they want to do about it. Sadwings Raging says the moat just got 10 foot deeper. Calvin I says it's an excuse to use the hobby for more crap. Yes, exactly. Lord Sathar says in 80s D&D, I was playing a fighter who was a total dude bro who wanted to bash monsters. Yeah. Charles Anderson says, I'll bet his life was hard. He got bullied for being a nerd, playing D&D during the 80s, Satanic Panic and all. Yeah, well, not to mention, he was apparently gay as a kid in a small town in Colorado in the 1980s. Yeah, if it was like, you know, I mean, there are some people that you can't tell one way or the other, right? But if he was kind of one of, you know, expressively effeminate in any way, then that would have been a tough place to be that, right? But he doesn't choose to talk about that. Instead, he talks about this like incredibly flimsy, like threadbare, thin racial heritage, the one tiny part of himself that isn't white, and he turns it into like the center of his story, right? Which is nonsense. And NAD says, Watsy's motto, when you're in a hole, keep digging. Yeah. Vodamanjiro says, this is a stereotype of an essay which fails to concisely get to the point is an unreadable mess of word salad. It is, absolutely. It's horrible. Horribly written. And so much of what these guys do is like that because they have no ability to do research, right? They also have no training, I think, in actually in actually writing in a way that is meant to be concise and get points across because they don't really have points, right? They have a message that they want to sell. And the only way to do that is by covering it in extra treacle of personalized, you know, life experience bullshit, most of which they make up. NAD says, I need to run Mr. Justice's furry disabled PC of color through my campaign. Patrick Ellison says, complete bullshit. For my money, they're just LARPing wounds they never suffered. And I believe Patrick is from around Colorado and such. You might know. Lord Sather says, we didn't even know about campaign rules, just made shit up and as we went along until somebody used his birthday money to write a model. Yeah, a lot of people did that. I made my first homebrew world, I think, when I was like 13, maybe. And before and after that, I would still, you know, because there's products you could find and not find, products you could afford and not afford. And so like, you know, the contrary to the now myth of the kind of the bro SR that back in the 80s, everyone's playing AD&D first edition rules is written and they were making their own world. That's That's not very true at all. I think we just had a blip there. I hope you guys can still hear me. Anyway, if you can, yeah, I'm sure you can still hear me, right? Okay. So like what we did back then was we would buy whatever we could buy, and it would usually mix everything up together. And like we'd use stuff from Greyhawk, from the Realms, from Mystara, from whatever, and anything that looked cool, we just stuff it into our campaign, right? I think that's how most people did it back then, because you were kids and you had an allowance or whatever, or some money that you got from doing some job or something, but you didn't have a lot of money and you just get what you could get, secondhand bookstores and stuff like that. There were a few in my town, so it was lucky in that sense. Calvinani says, I'm tanned up now. Here in California, many Mexicans think I'm Mexican at times or mixed. Hilarious. Well, Latinos are not a race. I'm Latino. I don't look Mexican at all, right? Like even Mexicans in Mexico, there's a wide range of physical appearance, right? From people that look like me in some parts to people that look absolutely indigenous, right? But and there are Black Latinos and there are Asian Latinos and there are Jewish Latinos, right? There's all kinds of Latinos. Latino is a culture; it's not a race. Dice still says, I'm happy to say here in rural California, we have a diverse population. No one really cares. We treat each other as people. Yeah, but I feel bad for anyone living in rural California because you're governed by urban California, and that's a disaster zone. Like if there was a way you guys could separate and join all the neighboring states, I'm sure you would. Charles Anderson says, yeah, sounds like he just got bullied for being a nerd and is doing a lot of historical revisionism. NAD says, yeah, go live downtown Oakland for a year and tell me how civilized things are. Dice still says, I grew up in a town that hated my ethnicity. I don't let that affect my life as an adult. I feel sorry for people who judge you based on your race or ethnic heritage. Calvinoni says, I live 60 miles from Oakland. I'd be careful driving there. Calvinoni says, I never heard that Gary did that. I assume that's about the miniatures and stuff. Yeah, like that sounds to me like some kind of pseudo story that they've invented, but it could be. I don't know. We know that in the early days, they had to find famously some of the monsters, like the Rust monster, was from like these sets of like little monster figures that he found at a toy store or something. There was a lot of having to rough it, right? Because the problem was there wasn't any orc miniatures when D&D got its first start, right? So if you were going to use miniatures, you had to use something for them. Matthew Kane says, human is interesting to play. Yeah. Well, I famously did a video on this channel that says your favorite race sucks unless it's human. Calvin says, my wife is Black from Africa, but she says many American Blacks are not friendly. Well, it's a very different thing to be from Africa. It kind of depends where from Africa you are, right? But yeah, the experience is totally different. My name says, when I was a kid, I wanted to be Legolas, so I played an elf. I didn't have anything to do with not wanting to play a human. Yeah, I mean, that's justifiable, sure. Like, I mean, if you were a big fan of Tolkien and you like Legolas or Gimli or whatever, you were playing, if you want to play an elf because you want to be the kind of elf archetype, fine, you can do that, right? That's why demi-humans are still kind of acceptable from my point of view, right? The problem is nowadays you have stuff like tieflings and Asubar and stuff that aren't really races of traditional myth. They're just humans using funny cosplay, basically, because they have no traits of their own, especially now in 5th edition, where tieflings are not, cursed by their demonic blood or anything like that. They're just, oh, it's totally cool. Yeah, my grandfather was a demon and I'm super cool for that, right? It's like, then it's nothing, it's just a complete fashion substitute for playing a human that actually has a personality. Instead, your personality is just what your character looks like. Lord Sather says, dude, civilization versus nature is like 99% of what pagan mythology is about. Exactly. The further back you go into less developed civilizations and eventually into tribal cultures, the more rigid they are about maintaining order as opposed to the chaos of nature, because they understand how lethal that is, you know. Xnard Prime says, Victor, Colorado is 1 hour and 4 minutes away from Colorado Springs, a thriving university town. It's not some culturally bigoted, total isolated shithole. Yeah, but remember, to these people, anywhere outside of the left coasts are horrible places. They have to present them as such, right? Because it's part of condemning America, right? The only places that are tolerable are these gigantic cities full of, you know, tents of indigent people. Yeah. D&D Old Guard says my home campaign is in Mystara. Literally every culture is there. Yeah, I love Mystara. It's great. It's a ridiculous, crazy quilt of a world, but it's so cool. NAD says, sounds like this article is just an expressive self-therapy session for Mr. Justice. Yeah. Marxist word salad, says Surly Unicorn. Exactly. Calvin says, it's hard being a country boy in the city or around all the rich people here. I do pest control, service industry is tough. Well, I feel for you. Overkill Joe says, life is tough on the res, man, or did he grow up in the burbs? Wait, no, according to him, he grew up in a small town. He never lived among, you know, as a kid, he never lived among any actual natives. His dad's grandmother or great-grandmother was native. That is his incredibly tenuous connection to what he's now made his entire living off of. Dice Tale says, why is this essay in a book about D&D? Well, deconstructionism. That's the point. This book, the essays in this book, their point is to deconstruct D&D, is to tear it down, because it is representative in their minds of part of Western culture, and everything in Western culture has to be destroyed, has to be deconstructed and condemned as evil, and then restructured into a means of propaganda for leftism. Dice still says, I think this guy's trolling us. He probably plays AD&D first edition and loves it. Yeah, he does swing dancing with Jeffro. Marduk versus Tiamat. Lord Sathler says, Marduk versus Tiamat, one of the oldest myths in humanity, right, in human civilization, is the triumph of rationalism and civilization versus the destructive forces of nature and chaos. Yes, exactly. Absolutely right. D&D Old Guard says, oh, good God, of course he hates Robert E. Howard and Tolkien. My name says, I've known some flamingly gay guys that aren't as butthurt as this guy. No, of course, I've met a lot of them. I mean, there were several theater kids in my high school D&D group too, you know, and theater kids was usually back then it was a euphemism, you know, and they were totally cool. They were great gamers. They liked to have fun playing our D&D, you know, and they didn't fall for any of this bullshit. This guy needs a therapist, says Calvinoni. I'm not sure any therapist can help him. Who did that? NAD says, come on, Drow can't even play basketball. My name says, I'm Gen X Calvinoni. We didn't care if you were gay or anything else as long as you weren't an asshole. Exactly. I'm also Gen X, and I agree with that message. D&D Old Guard says, Betty loves Blue Rose. I don't think so, because I think that Blue Rose is very 2005 leftist. It's very liberal, but it's still written from a perspective of like white middle class liberalism. So nowadays, at least, he would claim it's problematic. There's a reason the second edition of Blue Rose, when they did that whole reboot, did not do well, even among, you know, the usual suspects. My name says, golly dwarves and Kender, how vile. I think I once read something by Octavia Butler. Well, I would take Gully Dwarves and Kender over Octavia Butler any day of the week. My name says, as I recall, Octavia Butler was a left-wing nut before it was cool. Yeah, she's one of the original left-wing nuts. Dice Hill says, so we're celebrating the 50th anniversary by condemning the game as racist, misogynistic, hateful, and just bad. Well, that's what WotC is doing too, so it's not surprising. They've taken the lead on that. And he says, bingo, bingo, BIPOC was the last SJW word I needed. Yeah, he pretty much throws everything into the mix there, doesn't he? Odamanjiro says, I'm sure this guy was praised by his English professors for his writing. Oops, now I missed. Where was I? Damn it, I've lost my spot. Oh, here we go. What other comments have we got here? Stepping back, NAD says, stepping back, it's pretty hilarious and sad we've reached this point in America and within the RPG world. Totally surreal. Lord Sadler says, dude became Cherokee in college, I bet. Well, you know, like, in a situation where calling yourself Native American, even if you're only 1/32 Native American and didn't grow up in that culture, will give you instant benefits, like literal monetary benefits, priority in, you know, being admitted into faculties and things like that. Of course, and I mean, university is full of people who do that, right? I mean, Elizabeth Warren did that, right? Like she stole a spot from an actual Cherokee by pretending to be one, you know. So it's really disgusting, actually. Oh, $5 super chat from Packrat. Off topic, but would you ever consider doing showcase of content that is using 5e as intended, i.e. hacked and modified in created ways? Yes, I would consider doing that if I come across those, you know. Like, I know that there are some products of third-party 5e stuff, like in the DMs Guild and stuff like that, that is apparently doing creative things with 5e, which is awesome. I love that. Right, but I haven't had a lot of experience with that myself. Right, of reading that, because I don't go around looking at products on DMs Guild, you know. But if people know about something like that and it looks cool and it's not woke or whatever, it's just, you know, a cool mod of 5e, I would love to see stuff like that. You know, like and I would probably, you know, at the very least share it on my social media. Let's see what else we've got here. It's all fun and games says, even if you're 1/64th Cherokee, it's okay to be proud of your heritage. It's just not okay to be obnoxious about it. Yeah. Well, it's not okay to pretend like, you know, if you're like 1/64th Chinese or something, right? You don't want to go around suddenly acting as though, you know, as though you've lived your whole life in Kowloon or something, you know, like that, because it's one thing to say, yeah, I have ancestry at this, you know, in the past of this, right? But that doesn't mean that's my culture, right? Like, you know, I am 50% Polish, right? But I don't pretend that that's my own culture. I'm very proud of it. I mean, of course, I come from a very notable Polish family. and I'm quite proud to be Polish, but I don't pretend like like I know everything about modern Polish culture or something. I don't even speak the language, right? So I'm not gonna go around acting like my Polishness is the central defining aspect of my being, right? It certainly is something that had an influence on me. I wrote an RPG about it, right? And I think it's really cool, and it's fine to look into. Part of it was an exercise in learning even more about my own heritage, right? Um, but it's not, there's a difference between that and turning it into this kind of obnoxious cosplay, right? It's like if you found out, I don't know, if you're American, there's a good chance, there's a chance at least that you might have some African American blood, right? And you might be like, I don't know, uh, 1/16th or 1/32nd black. But if you go from there to like wearing a dashiki and talking about black power, right? then you're just a joke, right? It's not it's kind of an insult. XNR Prime says a gay, obviously mostly white man claiming American Indian heritage and virtue signaling them is one of the worst insults to injury to their genocide. Yeah. Well, and I mean, like the Cherokees are, they have that particularly odd kind of standard for what defines actual membership in the Cherokee Nation, right? If you're a descendant of the Dawes roll, you can be a citizen, so to say, of the Cherokee Nation, and that includes some people that were not racially Cherokee, because the Cherokee adopted a certain number of black freedmen after the Civil War into their nation, and they recognized the descendants of those people as Cherokee as well, right? Even if they didn't really have any Cherokee blood, but they still hate people who falsely, and they go out of their way to try to disprove people who falsely claim Cherokee descent, and for them, it's unlike certain other tribes, they have a very clear standard. Now, other tribes and other reservations in Canada and the U.S. Put a condition of like sanguinity, right? That if you have a parent who is Cherokee, then you still can count as Cherokee. But I don't know, if you're less than a quarter Cherokee, then you're not, or something, or not Cherokee, or Native in one of these other tribes, right? And some of them have conditions that have to do with whether you grew up in a reservation or as part of the culture, right? And sometimes those are more strict and sometimes those are more vague, right? But in the case of the Cherokee, they have a very specific definition, and yet there are tons of people, because there are a lot of Cherokee that, because of that definition, there are a lot of Cherokee that don't look Cherokee, they're nevertheless technically Cherokee. They really hate people that lie about it, though. Let me see what else we've got to say here. Packrat says, I run 5e as intended, hacked, modded, and crammed full of anything I can strip mine from all the OSR and the classical and other TTRPGs I own again, as intended. That was absolutely as it was intended by Mike Merles. He wanted that. I wanted that too, right? But that was the goal. The whole point was that 5e was something that you could mod the hell out of, and yet so few people have done that. Let me see here. Xnard says, I'm 52 years old and no one hardly gave an F about rules as written to the damn letter. Not from our teenage minds by any stretch. Absolutely. Sadwings Raging says LARPing as demons. Yeah. Matthew Caden says, so is a Minotaur more acceptable as a player character than a skunk man? Well, here's what I would say. All right. It depends on the campaign you're running. Now, I run historically accurate, historically authentic campaigns, right? Like Sword and Caravan, like Dark Albion, like Baptism of Fire. And in those, you have to be human, right? Human characters are the only player characters. On the other hand, I also run World of the Last Sun, which is an absolutely batshit Gonzo setting. And in that setting, like I've literally made a book about this, the Gonzo Fantasy Companion, that has in it generators that lets you create incredibly weird races, mutant humans of all kinds, and even lets you play intelligent animals, right? And there's rules for all that and mechanics for you to make those in your game. And you can use those in any OSR game. Right. So if your game is like it's Gonzo, then it's fine to have any of those. To have a skunk man, sure. Like a skunk man would literally be a playable race that you could generate in World of the Last Sun in the Gonzo Fantasy Companion book. If you haven't checked it out, you should really take a look. The Gonzo Fantasy Companion is a great workbook. It not only has stuff on generating races and weird races and stuff like that in your fantasy games, but also it has generators for like ancient complexes. It has a whole bunch of stuff on magic items and other weird items. It's full of useful material for any kind of campaign that you want to do of like weird fantasy or Gonzo fantasy. And in that sort of context, it's fine if that is the gist of the game, right? But the problem is you got to understand what kind of game you're running and what you want it to be, right? So if you want it to be like kind of a classic fantasy, you probably shouldn't have a skunk man. And odds are you shouldn't have a Minotaur either, though it depends. If it's somewhere a little bit in the weirder side of fantasy. I mean, like I know that there were like Minotaur player characters in Dragonlands, so you know you can do it in theory, right? But at least a Minotaur is still closer to the elements of traditional fantasy than some just rando, you know, furry race or something like that. Oops. Lost it again here. Here we go. Dicetail says it's weird that the topic of this live stream is so depressing and yet so funny. Yeah, for sure. The freeform, Dicetail says the freeform nature of early editions was really lived during. That's the thing. In actual old school, people were constantly innovating. They were constantly inventing stuff. It was the exact opposite of rules as written. That was never the point. Let me see what other people have said here. Dicetail says, Pundit, coming from the culture that gave us kielbasa, does give you bragging rights. Yeah, we also invented vodka, so there is that. Calvin only says, my wife has an English accent. I'm going to accuse her of cultural appropriation. Packrat says, my mom's mom, that's to say your grandmother, in other words, is 100% Cherokee and her dad is Irish. And my dad's parents are both Irish, so I'm technically native, but look super white, red beard and all. And you are a status Cherokee then, Packrat? You're officially recognized by the Cherokee. But yeah, I mean, that is technically possible. For the Cherokee, it is. So I can't completely discount. This guy might be, his ancestor might be from the Dawsville, and then technically he's a Cherokee, but he wasn't culturally raised as a Cherokee. In his own essay, he admits that, you know, that his family was completely estranged from their Indian roots, right? Or whatever, from the Indian roots of his dad's great grandmother, you know. So you can't, on that basis, it's pretty hard to go around spending the rest of your career doing Indian cosplay, you know, Native American cosplay, I should say. Starlaw says that the problem isn't only that they want to play a Smurf in D&D, but they want to force everyone to play a Smurf. Yeah, that's pretty much it. All right, I think I'm caught up here. Yeah, okay, I am caught up now. Packrat says, I was raised in Southwest Virginia and was not exposed to much of my grandmother's culture, just her personality and some rich ideas. And I mean, that's great. That's fine, right? I'm not criticizing this guy for having a great grandmother who was Cherokee, right? I'm criticizing him for appropriating that into an entire career for himself and then retroactively pretending it was a major part of his childhood, you know? All right, so I want to know if there's anybody else that has any other questions and comments for the before we wrap things up. That was basically what I wanted to talk to you about for this. I covered everything about Baptism of Fire. Eventually, when I get the books here, of course, I'll be doing, you know, chapter by chapter examinations of the books. Not really reviews because I'm the writer, but I'll be doing some more kind of info dumps about what you can find in Baptism of Fire. Yeah, we'll if there's anyone that has any last questions or things they want to talk about before we finish up, now would be the time to do it. While people are thinking about that, I will say, if you haven't already, please subscribe, hit the like button, share my videos, and check out all my products in every description, including in the description here. If you click the little more button, you can see links to all of my different books and products, and you're bound to find stuff that you're going to really enjoy. None of them are woke. All of them are pretty different from your standard OSR stuff, but very much part of the OSR movement. And you know, especially check out Baptism of Fire. There's a reason why it's been so successful in its launch. You're going to see that it is a very cool game to have and to use. And like I said, some people are running it as Baptism of Fire. Some people are using it to mine for ideas and for the tables, the random rolls, and for the monsters, and for the magic system and everything else, which are stuff that's totally unique compared to everybody else's OSR stuff. So it's stuff you can bring into your existing OSR games. And check out the Pundit files on the Red Room Webstore. And check out all the other cool stuff that's on the Red Room Webstore, but especially the Pundit files. We are now up to issue number 12, and there'll be more forthcoming. And remember that every single issue of the Red Room, regardless of size or content, costs $3.50. Okay, so if you can get $3.50, you can buy an issue of the Pundit files. And you're going to find, I mean, there's 12 of them now. There are going to be more. But just like the Pundit Presents series, which you can find in DriveThruRPG, if you look through the list, you're bound to find something that's going to be interesting to you, because it's on a wide variety. Each issue is on a different topic, right? And it's wide varieties of topics. Some are adventures, some are supplements, some are other things, new rules, classes, things like that. All kinds of stuff. You're going to find stuff that's cool. NAD says, thanks for holding the fort for things of this nature, Pundit. Keep it up. Thank you. Dragon Shadow says, any thoughts on Arcanum or Arduin? I don't really have any thoughts on Arcanum. Arduin was cool. You know, it was in many ways the first real third-party alternative product stuff for D&D. So to the downside being that it made that part of all of this nonsense that some of the OSR people do of like, no, it's meant to be played only with the official rules and only the way it was written. A lot of that was just essentially a marketing tactic by TSR to try to convince people to buy TSR books and not Arduin books, you know. But nobody took it very seriously at the time, right? The problem is today people read that and they don't understand that context, you know. So E. Clark says that old Loch Ness monster wanted 350. All right, you know the reference. You are one of the ones. You are one of the true initiates there, E. Clark. Packrat says pundit material got strip mined early at our table. That's great. I love that. I'm very happy for people to use my products in whatever way. What I want, all of my games are made, all my game products are made to be highly playable and highly adaptable, right? So like, you know, my latest issue of the Pundit Files is an adventure. It's called The Mendicant. It's technically centered in medieval Chester in the Dark Albion setting, but you could very easily port the whole adventure into any kind of moderate market town in any fantasy setting, and it would still work, you know. So that's the idea, is you can use it straight or you can adapt it to your own stuff, right? And I'm happy either way. Arduin was the cool kid on the block when it came out, says Dice Tales. Yeah, well, a big part of it was just that it was so, you know, it was different. It felt different from your standard D&D fare, right? And a lot of it was a bit more experimental. Some of it was probably not as well designed in some ways, but it made up for that with being weird and cool, right? And it was the beginning of people loving weird and cool. And in many ways, the OSR owes a fairly big debt to Arduin and the coolness of what that kind of weird experimental attitude they had really did, right? Richard Kuhn says, would fairy magic and baptism of fire work for a Victorian Invisible College game? Well, I mean, yes. If you look at Invisible College, the magic system is, at its core, it's the same system. So you could certainly take any of the magic that is in either Baptism of Fire or in the grimoires from the old school companion, and with very little adaptation, you could make it into magical practices for the Invisible College, for sure. Because it is, again, it's still fundamentally the same magic system, a slightly different mechanic, but it's the same thing. Trash says he sure was pissed that Loch Ness Monster was about ready to kick your ass. Packrat says you should do a segment where you fix modern settings in 3 rules or less. Yeah, well, maybe. I mean, I can think of things that would fix. You know, it would be very easy to fix 5e. You know, to make it more. You know, to make it more OSR. More Arduin is coming, says Calvinoni. Well, I guess technically, yeah, you could say there's more stuff called Arduin that could be coming, but in a way, to me, like Arduin is, that's kind of like saying, well, you know, we got a band and we're calling them Led Zeppelin, right? And maybe, I don't know, Robert Plant is in there, you know, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the same as the original. Dawn of Consequence says, no wonder that Loch Ness Monster keeps coming back if you gave him Tree Fitty. All right, guys. I guess that's about it for today. I will be getting back to you in due time. I don't know. I never know when I have time to do a live stream. I'm not like, you know, Double D has his regular show on Wednesday. Other people have their shows on Tuesdays or Mondays or Fridays. I don't. I usually try to give about 24 hours notice when I'm going to do a live stream. But keep watching for other live streams and also for my regular videos, which will be coming up routinely, I'm sure. And yeah, I will see you guys next time, I guess. Thank you for watching. All right, how do I turn this off? Oh, there it is. I never know how to do this. There we go.